The foot-in-the-door technique is a psychological strategy that works by getting someone to agree to a small, easy request first, which increases the chances they'll later agree to a larger one. It's based on the principle of consistency. Once people commit to something, even something minor, they're more likely to continue acting in ways that align with that commitment. This technique is widely used in marketing, sales, social influence, and even personal relationships. The name comes from door-to-door sales, where a salesperson might start by asking if they can share a quick brochure just to get their foot in the door. Once the homeowner agrees to the small request, the door is literally and figuratively open to a bigger ask, like making a purchase or scheduling a demo. Now would be the perfect moment for a tiny ask. Give this video a like. It's quick, and it helps a lot more than you might think. Funny enough, that's actually a perfect example of the foot-in-the-door technique in action. A small commitment that could lead to a deeper one later, like subscribing or sharing. A famous study from the 1960s demonstrated this effect. Researchers asked homeowners to put a small "Drive safely" sign in their window. Many agreed. A week later, the same people were asked to allow a large, unsightly billboard with the same message to be placed on their lawn. Surprisingly, those who had agreed to the small sign were far more likely to say yes to the large billboard compared to a control group who received only the larger request. The small commitment had set the stage for a bigger one. This technique shows up all the time. A charity might first ask you to sign a petition, then later request a donation. Businesses offer free trials or small discounts before pitching a more expensive product or subscription. Social causes start by asking for a share on social media, and later push for more active involvement. Even in relationships, someone may ask for a small favor, then gradually build to larger ones, all through the momentum of prior agreement. But is the foot-in-the-door technique manipulative? It depends on how it's used. If the requests are honest, and the person has the freedom to decline at any time, the technique can be seen as a fair way to build cooperation and commitment. However, if the initial request is made purely as a setup, or if the second request is far more demanding than expected, it can feel sneaky or coercive. It's especially manipulative if the person isn't fully aware of what they're being drawn into, or if the strategy is used to take advantage of their desire to appear consistent or agreeable. The best defense against this subtle influence is awareness. Just because you agreed to something small doesn't mean you're obligated to accept the next request. Ask yourself whether each decision aligns with your values and interests, rather than simply following a pattern of yeses. Ultimately, the foot-in-the-door technique shows how powerful small actions can be in shaping future behavior, for better or worse, depending on how they're used. And hey, since you've already liked the video, here's a slightly bigger ask. Before you sleep, consider subscribing and maybe even sharing it with a friend. Small steps, but they go a long way. And now you've seen the foot-in-the-door technique in action again. The door-in-the-face technique is a powerful psychological persuasion strategy used to increase the chances of getting someone to agree to a request. It works by starting with a large, often exaggerated or unreasonable request, one that most people will reject. After this initial refusal, the person making the request follows up with a smaller, more reasonable ask. Because the second request seems modest in comparison, people are much more likely to accept it. In essence, it's the opposite of the foot-in-the-door technique, but just as effective. Imagine you're at a store and a salesperson approaches you asking if you'd be willing to buy a premium membership, costing $300 per year. That's a lot to commit to, so most people would say no right away. Then the salesperson lowers the ask, saying something like, "Okay, how about a basic membership for $30 a year?" Suddenly, that smaller offer feels much more affordable and reasonable. Compared to the first big request, the second one feels like a good deal, and you're more likely to say yes, even if you hadn't planned on joining at all. What's happening here is more than just comparing prices. The door-in-the-face technique triggers a psychological principle called reciprocal concession. When someone makes a concession by lowering their initial demand, we feel a social pressure or obligation to also make a concession and agree to the smaller request. It's a kind of unspoken negotiation where both sides meet in the middle. We don't want to seem rude or inflexible after someone has backed down, so we comply. This technique is used frequently in sales, fundraising, negotiations, and everyday interactions. For example, a charity volunteer might first ask you to commit to donating a large amount or volunteering many hours. When you decline, they'll ask if you can at least make a small donation or volunteer for just a short time. Because the second request is a compromise, you're more likely to agree, even if you initially intended to say no altogether. Political campaigns also use this method. A volunteer might first ask if you can help with an entire day of canvassing, a big ask for most people. When you decline, they might follow up asking if you could just share a post on social media or sign a petition. That smaller, easier request feels more doable after the larger one, increasing your chance of participation. But is the door-in-the-face technique manipulative? Like many persuasion tactics, it depends on the intention behind it. When used honestly, it can help create fair compromises and open communication. However, if the initial large request is knowingly unreasonable and only meant to trick or pressure someone into agreeing to the smaller one, then it becomes manipulative. This can lead to feelings of resentment or regret later on. Knowing about this technique helps us both as communicators and as consumers. If you're trying to persuade someone, starting with a larger request and following up with a smaller one can be a useful strategy. Just be mindful to use it ethically. On the other hand, if you recognize the door in the face being used on you, you can pause and consider whether you're agreeing because you truly want to, or just because of social pressure. It's important to remember that saying no is always an option. Awareness is your best defense against being influenced unfairly. Understanding these tactics gives you the power to make clearer, more conscious decisions, rather than automatically falling into patterns of compliance. In conclusion, the door-in-the-face technique shows how our natural desire to be polite and reciprocal can be used to influence decisions. By starting with a big request and then retreating to a smaller one, persuaders can increase their chances of success. Recognizing this method helps you respond with greater awareness, whether you're negotiating, selling, or simply trying to make sense of everyday social interactions. Have you ever walked into a store, seen a jacket labeled at $300, and then noticed it's on sale for $180, and suddenly that $180 seems like a bargain? That's not just clever marketing. That's a psychological principle at work called anchoring. Anchoring is a cognitive bias in which people rely too heavily on the first piece of information they receive, the anchor, when making decisions. Once that anchor is set, it influences how we perceive all subsequent information. Even if the anchor is random or unrelated, our brains tend to use it as a reference point and adjust from there, often not enough. This results in skewed judgments and decisions. The concept was first introduced by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in the 1970s, and it's one of the most robust and well-documented biases in human behavior. It plays a major role in everything from shopping and salary negotiations to courtroom decisions and everyday conversations. Let's take a simple example. Imagine you're negotiating your salary. If you throw out the number $80,000 right away, you've anchored the discussion at that level. Any counteroffer from your employer will likely be influenced by that number, even if they initially intended to offer less. On the other hand, if they speak first and say $65,000, that becomes the anchor, and you might find yourself negotiating closer to their figure instead of your ideal. Anchoring is everywhere. In marketing, you'll often see prices listed as was $250, now only $149. That $250 is the anchor. Even if the product was never actually worth that much, your brain uses that number as a benchmark, making the new price seem more reasonable, even appealing. Real estate agents also use anchoring. A home listed at a high price sets expectations. Even if a buyer negotiates down, their sense of the home's value is shaped by that initial figure. In courtrooms, studies have shown that when prosecutors recommend harsh sentences, jurors often anchor their decisions to those numbers, even if they seem excessive. And this doesn't just happen with numbers. Anchoring can occur with ideas too. The first impression we form of someone, whether they seem confident, nervous, friendly, or cold, becomes the anchor for how we interpret their behavior later. Even when new information contradicts that first impression, our brains tend to adjust only slightly, rather than fully reevaluating. So, is anchoring manipulative? Not necessarily. Sometimes it's a helpful shortcut, a way for our minds to quickly make sense of unfamiliar information. But when it's used intentionally to steer decisions, it can become a subtle form of manipulation. Retailers, advertisers, negotiators, and even news outlets use it to shape how we think and what we choose, often without us realizing it. Now here's where this gets practical. If you're aware of anchoring, you can use it to your advantage, and defend against it too. For example, when making a decision, try to pause and consider whether you're being influenced by an arbitrary starting point. Ask yourself, would I still think this is a good deal if I hadn't seen that original number? You can also set your own anchors, especially in negotiations, by confidently introducing a reasonable figure first. Anchoring teaches us that context matters more than we think. Our decisions aren't always based on logic or research, but on comparisons, often ones we didn't choose. Just being aware of this mental shortcut can make you a smarter decision maker. So next time you're about to make a purchase, negotiate a deal, or size up a situation, take a moment to ask yourself, what's anchoring my judgment right now? The answer might surprise you, and just knowing it puts you back in control. Priming. Have you ever seen a commercial for a refreshing drink? Ice, condensation, slow motion, and suddenly, even if you weren't thirsty, you start craving something cold? That's not just clever advertising. That's a psychological phenomenon known as priming. Priming is a subtle but powerful process where exposure to one stimulus influences your response to another, often without your conscious awareness. Your brain gets primed by something you've recently seen, heard, or thought about, and that shapes how you react to what comes next. It's like a mental nudge that steers your perception, memory, or behavior. One of the most famous studies on priming was conducted by John Bargh, Mark Chen, and Lara Burrows in 1996. It was published in the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology, and it's a perfect example of how subtle cues can unconsciously affect behavior. The researchers wanted to test whether exposure to stereotypes or trait-related concepts, such as aging, could directly influence a person's actions, even in a short period of time. Participants were told they were taking part in a simple language task, specifically a sentence unscrambling exercise. Each person was given jumbled sets of 5 words, and they had to form grammatically correct 4-word sentences. There were 2 groups of participants. The primed group, often referred to as the elderly prime group, received word sets that subtly included terms associated with old age, like Florida, wrinkle bingo, gray ancient retired. The control group received only neutral, unrelated words that had no connection to age or stereotypes. No one was told that the words had any thematic significance, and the participants had no idea the study had anything to do with behavior. After finishing the sentence task, participants were told they could leave the room. But this was actually the most critical part of the study. As each person walked down the hallway to exit, researchers secretly timed how long it took them to walk. Participants who had been exposed to the elderly-related words walked significantly more slowly than those in the control group, despite having no conscious awareness that the words had anything to do with aging or slowness. The conclusion? Their brains had been primed with the stereotype of old age, and it subtly influenced their behavior. This study sparked huge interest in the field of automatic behavior, showing that even a few unrelated words can activate deeply embedded associations that affect how we move, think, or act. Priming doesn't just affect motion. It can influence our attitudes, decisions, even our emotions. For example, if you read or hear words related to kindness, like warm, gentle, caring, you're more likely to act politely in your next interaction. On the other hand, if you're exposed to negative or aggressive cues, you might find yourself reacting more irritably without realizing why. You see priming all the time in marketing. Advertisers use words, sounds, and images to get your brain into a certain mode: craving, excitement, comfort, urgency, so that you're more likely to take action, like buying something or clicking a link. So is priming manipulative? Sometimes, yes, especially when it's used to influence behavior without transparency. But more often, it's just part of how our minds work. We're constantly absorbing cues from our surroundings, and they shape our mental and emotional state. Being aware of priming puts the power back in your hands. You can learn to spot it when it's being used on you, and you can use it intentionally to influence your own mindset in a positive direction. Have you ever noticed that when two people really connect, they start to act a bit like each other? Maybe they lean in the same way, use similar words, or even mirror each other's gestures without realizing it. That's not a coincidence. It's something called mirroring. Mirroring is a subconscious behavior where one person subtly imitates the body language, speech patterns, or attitudes of another. It's a social signal, a nonverbal way of saying, "I'm like you," or "I'm connected to you." Psychologically, mirroring creates rapport, increases trust, and helps build stronger connections between people, even if they don't realize it's happening. This effect is deeply rooted in how we, as social creatures, bond with others. When someone mirrors us, whether it's our posture, tone, or even our energy, we tend to feel seen, heard, and understood. And the best part? Most of this happens below the surface. Our brains are wired to pick up on these cues and respond to them emotionally, even if we're not consciously aware of them. Let's look at a common example, a conversation between two friends. One leans forward, and shortly after, the other leans forward too. One crosses their legs, and a minute later, the other does the same. These subtle movements send a powerful signal: we're in sync. In fact, studies have shown that when people are engaged in a warm, trusting conversation, their movements tend to unconsciously align. They nod together, smile at the same time, and even blink in rhythm. Mirroring goes beyond body language. It can also happen in speech. You might notice that when you're talking to someone with a particular accent or pace, you start to speak a little more like them. You might adopt their slang, their tone, or even their emotional energy. This is called linguistic mirroring, and it's a key part of effective communication. Professionals like therapists, salespeople, and negotiators often use mirroring deliberately to build trust and connection. For example, a therapist might match a client's speaking pace or use similar language to help them feel more comfortable. In business, a salesperson might subtly adopt the customer's posture or tone during a pitch to create subconscious rapport. But mirroring isn't just a persuasion trick. It's something we all do naturally, especially when we feel empathy or interest. In fact, children begin to mirror adults from infancy. That's how they learn social behaviors, language, and emotional expression. It's one of the earliest forms of connection we experience. Interestingly, mirroring can even influence how much someone likes you. Research has shown that people who are mirrored are more likely to view the other person positively. It feels validating, like you're being understood without needing to explain everything. So can mirroring be manipulative? It depends on how it's used. If someone is mirroring just to gain influence or deceive, it can come off as inauthentic, and people can sense that. But when done with genuine interest and empathy, it enhances connection and trust. The key is to keep it subtle and sincere. If you want to try mirroring yourself, start by simply paying attention. Notice the posture, tone, and pace of the person you're talking to. Don't copy them exactly. Just allow your own behavior to gently reflect theirs. Focus on building a real connection, and mirroring will often happen naturally. At its core, mirroring reminds us that communication isn't just about words. It's about rhythm, presence, and emotional resonance. When we mirror others, even in small, unconscious ways, we're not just mimicking, we're connecting. Gaslighting. It's a term you've probably heard before, maybe in a movie, in a relationship article, or on social media. But what does it really mean? At its core, gaslighting is a psychological manipulation technique designed to make someone question their own reality. It's not just lying. It's a deliberate, repeated effort to distort facts, memories, or perceptions so deeply that the other person begins to doubt their own mind. Imagine telling someone they left the stove on and they insist they didn't. Instead of just disagreeing, you say things like, "You always forget things," or "You're being dramatic. You probably dreamed it." Over time, those small seeds of doubt can grow into total confusion. The term gaslighting comes from a 1938 play and later a film called Gaslight, where a husband manipulates his wife into thinking she's going insane by dimming the gas lights in their home and then denying that the lights changed at all. The story was fictional, but the technique it portrayed is very real, and it happens more often than many realize. In psychological terms, gaslighting is a form of coercive control. It's subtle, often slow, and extremely damaging. Unlike overt abuse, gaslighting operates in the shadows. It makes the victim feel unsure, anxious, and increasingly dependent on the gaslighter for a version of truth. Researchers and therapists have identified common phrases used in gaslighting. Things like, "you're overreacting," or "that never happened," or even, "you're too sensitive." These comments might seem harmless in isolation, but when repeated consistently, they wear down confidence and create an internal conflict between what someone feels and what they're being told. Over time, the victim may begin to apologize excessively, second-guess their memories, or even start defending the abuser. That's the power of gaslighting. It replaces trust in oneself with uncertainty. In relationships, gaslighting can create a toxic dynamic where one person controls the emotional narrative. In workplaces, it can be used to silence dissent or avoid accountability. In larger systems, like politics or media, gaslighting can even be used to manipulate entire groups of people. When falsehoods are repeated often enough and reality is constantly challenged, people may begin to doubt even what they see with their own eyes. That's why gaslighting is not just personal. It's social, emotional, and sometimes even cultural. So is gaslighting always intentional? Not necessarily. Some people gaslight without realizing it, especially if they were raised in environments where manipulation was normalized. But regardless of intent, the effect is often the same: confusion, self-doubt, and emotional isolation. Recognizing gaslighting is the first step toward breaking its spell. When you begin to notice the patterns, the denial, the contradiction, the subtle undermining, you regain clarity. And from that clarity, you can rebuild your trust in your own thoughts and feelings. Gaslighting doesn't just alter how someone sees a situation, it can fundamentally reshape how they see themselves. Victims often describe feeling like they've lost their sense of identity. They may withdraw from friends and loved ones, unsure of who to trust or how to explain what's happening. Over time, chronic gaslighting can lead to anxiety, depression, and even symptoms of trauma, especially when it occurs over long periods. But healing is possible. Recovery starts by reconnecting with your own voice, writing down your experiences, speaking with trusted people, or working with a therapist to validate your reality. The moment you begin to trust your own perceptions again, the fog begins to lift, and with clarity comes strength. The strength to set boundaries, ask questions, and never again be made to feel small for simply remembering the truth. Being aware of gaslighting doesn't just protect you from being manipulated. It also helps you communicate more clearly, support others, and spot toxic dynamics before they take root. Awareness gives you the power to stay grounded, to stay calm, and to hold on to your truth, even when someone is trying to take it away. Scarcity. It's a feeling we all know, that little rush of urgency when something seems like it might disappear. Think about it. You see the words, "only 2 left in stock," or "a limited time offer" on a website, and suddenly you're reaching for your wallet, even if you weren't planning to buy anything. That's not a coincidence. It's the result of a psychological principle that runs deep in the human mind. Scarcity triggers something primal. When we believe something is rare, we automatically assign it more value. And when we think we might lose the chance to get it, we act quickly, sometimes irrationally. Scarcity is a well-documented concept in behavioral psychology. One of the most influential voices on this topic is Robert Cialdini, who outlines scarcity as one of the 6 key principles of persuasion in his book Influence. According to Cialdini, we're hardwired to fear loss more than we desire gain, a phenomenon known as loss aversion. That fear of missing out, or FOMO, isn't just cultural, it's psychological. When something appears scarce, our brain perceives it as more desirable, more exclusive, and more important, even if nothing about the item itself has changed. There are 2 types of scarcity: real and artificial. Real scarcity happens when a resource truly is limited, like tickets to a small concert or the last piece of artwork in a collection. Artificial scarcity, on the other hand, is created to generate urgency where none actually exists. Marketers often use countdown timers, flash sales, and phrases like "only available today" to trigger this response. In truth, the product may still be widely available tomorrow, but the pressure you feel is real, because the brain interprets limited access as increased importance. In fact, studies have shown that people will often rate a product or experience as more satisfying when they believe it's hard to get. This is known as scarcity heuristics, a mental shortcut where we assume that rarity equals quality. It's the same reason exclusive clubs, limited edition sneakers, or secret menus draw so much attention. The product doesn't have to be better, it just has to feel less available. This principle even applies to information. When we're told that something is restricted or insider only, we often believe it's more valuable or more truthful, simply because it seems like fewer people have access to it. Scarcity also plays a powerful role in social behavior. Research in social psychology has found that romantic interest increases when a person is perceived as less available. The less accessible someone is, emotionally or physically, the more we tend to idealize them. This is known as the scarcity effect in attraction, and it can distort our perception of connection, of chase people or experiences that might not actually align with our values or needs. In group settings, exclusivity, such as private clubs, invite-only apps, or elite memberships, builds allure through scarcity. It's not just what's offered that draws people in, it's who gets to access it. This principle isn't just used in sales. Scarcity shows up in relationships, attention, and even time. When someone pulls away, we often want them more. When our schedules feel packed, every free moment becomes more valuable. The less accessible something appears, the more we tend to chase it, whether it's a product, a person, or an opportunity. That's the paradox of scarcity. We often want what we think we can't have, even more than what we already do. But here's the catch. Scarcity can cloud judgment. It can make us rush decisions, spend money impulsively, or chase things we don't truly need, simply because they seem rare. That's why it's often used manipulatively, to drive urgency without offering real value. When scarcity is used without transparency, it can be deceptive. It's not just selling a product, it's shaping perception in a way that limits your choices before you've even thought them through. Still, scarcity isn't inherently bad. It can also help us prioritize. When time is short, we tend to focus on what matters. When we value something, we treat it more carefully. The key is recognizing the source. Is the scarcity real, or is it engineered? Is your urgency coming from within or being placed there by someone else? Becoming aware of how scarcity affects you helps restore clarity. The next time you feel rushed to decide, to buy, to commit, to act, pause. Ask yourself, is this truly rare? Or is it just framed that way? Awareness gives you back your agency. And with that, you can choose from a place of calm, not fear. Social proof. It's one of the quietest yet most persuasive forces shaping our thoughts, choices, and behavior. Without even realizing it, we often look to others to decide what's right, what's safe, and what's worth our attention. Imagine walking into a restaurant with two identical dining rooms. One is empty, the other is full. Even without tasting the food, most people will choose the crowded room. Why? Because our brains are wired to take cues from other people, especially in uncertain situations. If everyone else is doing it, it must be the right choice. Or at least, that's how it feels. Social proof is a psychological phenomenon where we assume the actions of others reflect correct behavior. It's especially powerful when we're unsure, like when we're trying a new product, making a difficult decision, or entering unfamiliar territory. Reviews, testimonials, follower counts, and 5-star ratings are all modern-day expressions of social proof. The more we see others engaging with something, the more valuable or trustworthy it seems. The roots of social proof go deep into evolutionary psychology. In early human history, group consensus often meant safety. Following the crowd could lead you to food, shelter, or protection. Straying too far from the group could be dangerous. That instinct still lives within us. It's why we check reviews before making a purchase, or why a line outside a store makes us think something good must be inside. Even online, a video with millions of views or a post thousands of likes gains an aura of importance, not because of the content alone, but because other people have already validated it. Social proof comes in several forms. Expert social proof is when people follow someone with perceived authority, like a doctor recommending a treatment. Celebrity social proof relies on fame. A product endorsed by a well-known figure gains immediate traction. User social proof is what you see in reviews or customer ratings. Wisdom of the crowd happens when large numbers of people support an idea or trend. And finally, peer social proof comes from people like us, friends, family, or people in our demographic, whose choices feel personally relevant. But as powerful as social proof is, it's not always accurate. Just because a lot of people are doing something doesn't mean it's the right or best choice. In some cases, it can create a false sense of consensus, like when fake reviews inflate a product's reputation, or bots are used to generate artificial popularity online. Social proof can be manipulated, especially in marketing, politics, or social media. It can lead to herd behavior, when people stop thinking critically and simply follow the majority, even if the majority is wrong. Social proof also affects how we act in emergencies. There's a phenomenon known as the bystander effect, where individuals are less likely to help someone in distress if others are present. Each person assumes someone else will step in, and the lack of action by others becomes its own kind of signal, reinforcing the idea that no action is needed. This, too, is social proof in action, sometimes leading us away from what we know to be right. Being aware of social proof doesn't mean ignoring others' choices, but it helps us pause and ask, am I doing this because it feels right? Or because everyone else is doing it? Awareness creates space for intention. It helps you make decisions based not just on consensus, but on clarity, value, and authenticity. Social proof is neither good nor bad. It's just part of how our minds navigate the world. The key is knowing when to trust the crowd and when to trust yourself. Social proof reminds us that we're deeply social creatures, often shaped not just by logic, but by belonging. Sometimes following the crowd can lead us to something valuable, even beautiful. Other times, it can take us away from our own instincts. The challenge isn't to reject what others are doing, but to stay connected to what matters most to you. In a world full of signals, popularity, and noise, the real skill is learning when to listen and when to look inward. If you're still awake at this point in the video, maybe it means something in this moment is resonating with you. If you're enjoying it, feel free to like, subscribe, or share it with someone who might need a little peace tonight. And if you're up for it, leave a comment below and let us know what time you're listening. It's always comforting to know we're not alone in these quiet hours. Thanks for spending them here. Authority bias. It's the tendency we all have to place more trust in people who appear to be in charge. Experts, leaders, or anyone who seems to know more than we do. Think of a person in a lab coat giving medical advice on a commercial, or a well-dressed spokesperson standing at a podium, speaking with confidence. Even if we don't know their credentials, something about their presence makes us listen more closely and question less. That's authority bias in action, when perceived authority shapes our beliefs, even before we've examined the facts. At its core, authority bias is about trust and hierarchy. It's rooted in how humans have always relied on leaders, parents, elders, chiefs, healers, to make sense of complex problems. In a world that can be uncertain, trusting someone who seems competent feels like a shortcut to safety. And often it works. Experts can offer real insight. Doctors, teachers, scientists, and experienced professionals can guide us through things we don't yet understand. But the key word there is perceived. Authority bias doesn't just respond to real expertise, it also responds to the appearance of it. This is why marketers and influencers often lean into signs of status or expertise. A suit, a stethoscope, a best-selling book, or even a confident tone of voice can trigger authority bias. One classic study from the 1960s, the Milgram experiment, showed how far this bias can go. In it, participants were instructed by a man in a lab coat to administer what they believed were electric shocks to another person. Despite hearing signs of distress from the person being shocked, most participants continued, simply because an authority figure told them to. The findings were unsettling. showing how deeply we're conditioned to follow instructions when they come from someone we view as legitimate. Authority bias isn't just about obedience. It affects how we consume information too. We're more likely to believe a quote if it's attributed to a famous name. We're more likely to accept a statement as true if it's said confidently by someone with credentials, or even just a large following. In politics, media, and even everyday conversation, authority bias can shape how ideas spread, not based on their truth, but on who says them. That doesn't mean we should reject authority altogether. Knowledge, experience, and leadership are valuable, but unchecked authority bias can lead to blind spots. We might ignore better advice, overlook conflicting evidence, or surrender our judgment just because someone else seems more qualified. It's especially risky when authority is faked, exaggerated, or used to push a personal agenda. So what can we do? We can learn to separate the message from the messenger. Ask, does this make sense on its own? Is there evidence behind it? Or am I just trusting the source? When we slow down and examine ideas for their merit rather than their packaging, we regain a sense of balance. True authority can stand up to questions. False authority relies on silence. Authority bias is natural. It doesn't make us weak, it just makes us human. But understanding how it works gives us room to think more freely. It invites us to be curious, to ask questions, and to honor both expertise and our own intuition. Fear appeal. It's a persuasive strategy that taps into one of our most primal emotions, fear, to change how we think or act. You've likely seen it in public health ads that show the dangers of smoking, or in commercials warning about the risks of not having insurance. Politicians, marketers, and even well-meaning educators use fear-based messaging to grab attention and push people toward a specific choice. And it works, because fear is powerful. When something feels threatening, our brains shift into alert mode. We focus, we react, we move. At its core, fear appeal works by presenting a threat, something negative that could happen, and then offering a solution or behavior that helps avoid that threat. It might be subtle, like warning about missed opportunities if you don't act now, or it might be intense, like a graphic image or urgent headline designed to spark anxiety. The goal is to motivate action by highlighting the consequences of inaction. And sometimes, that motivation can be genuinely helpful. Warnings about health risks or environmental dangers, for example, can prompt positive change, especially when paired with clear, constructive advice. In psychology, the extended parallel process model helps explain how fear appeals function. This model suggests that when people are faced with a fear-based message, they evaluate two things: the threat and the efficacy. In other words, they ask, is this a real danger? And can I do something about it? If both answers are yes, people are likely to take action. But if the threat feels overwhelming and the solution feels unclear or out of reach, the fear can backfire. It leads to fear control, like denial, avoidance, or shutting down, rather than danger control, which leads to positive behavior change. This is why fear appeals are common in anti-drug campaigns, anti-smoking ads, and health messaging around diseases like HIV or cancer. When handled carefully, fear can raise awareness and spark change. But when overused or dramatized, it can desensitize the audience. That's what researchers call message fatigue. When people see so many exaggerated warnings that they stop listening altogether. Over time, fear that's not paired with trust or helpful direction can start to feel like noise. And outside of public messaging, fear appeal is used in more subtle ways. In advertising, phrases like "don't miss out" or "last chance" play on our fear of loss. In politics, speeches often highlight threats to safety, economy, or identity, followed by promises of protection. Even in parenting or education, fear can be used unintentionally, warning children that they'll never succeed if they don't work harder. These kinds of appeals may have good intentions, but they often rely on fear to motivate behavior, rather than curiosity or confidence. There's also an emotional side to fear-based influence. Sometimes, fear isn't about external threats at all. It's about losing approval, disappointing others, or being seen as not enough. These internalized fears can be used manipulatively in relationships, workplaces, or social groups. Emotional threats like guilt, shame, or rejection create a different kind of pressure, softer on the surface but still deeply controlling. It's important to recognize when fear is being used to inform and when it's being used to pressure. When you feel that tightening in your chest, that urgency to react, pause. Ask yourself, is this fear grounded in reality? Is there a calm next step I can take? The moment you ask that, you've already begun to step outside the fear and back into your own clarity. Fear, after all, isn't the enemy. It's a signal, sometimes warning us, sometimes guiding us, but it doesn't have to control us. When we understand how fear appeal works, we can make choices based on thought, not panic. We can choose to act not because we're scared, but because we're ready. Repetition. It's simple, almost invisible, and yet one of the most powerful tools in shaping memory, beliefs, and behavior. When we hear something again and again, it starts to feel more familiar. And when something feels familiar, it starts to feel true. This is the foundation of repetition in psychology, whether it's a slogan, a song lyric, or a phrase in a speech. The more often something is repeated, the more likely it is to stick in your mind and influence your perception. This effect is known as the illusory truth effect, a cognitive bias where repeated information is more likely to be accepted as truth, regardless of whether it's accurate. Our brains tend to confuse familiarity with accuracy. Even if we don't fully believe something the first time we hear it, repeated exposure can wear down our resistance. Over time, the message feels smoother, more comfortable, and less likely to be questioned. Advertisers and marketers have known this for decades. That's why you hear brand names, taglines, and jingles over and over again. It's not about giving you new information. It's about planting a seed and letting familiarity do the rest. Political campaigns use repetition too. Candidates repeat key phrases not just to communicate, but to imprint. Slogans like, "Make America Great Again," or "Yes, we can," don't need depth. Their power comes from being memorable, repeated, and emotionally charged. Repetition doesn't just happen in media. It happens in our self-talk, our relationships, and our culture. If someone repeatedly tells you you're not good enough or that you're always making mistakes, that message, whether true or not, can start to echo inside your head. On the other hand, repeated affirmations of support, encouragement, or love can rewire your sense of self in a much more positive way. What gets repeated becomes internalized. In learning and education, repetition can be incredibly helpful. It strengthens neural pathways and helps new information take root. That's why teachers review key concepts and why spaced repetition is a proven method for long-term memory retention. But in manipulation or propaganda, repetition can be used to bypass critical thinking. It makes extreme ideas sound normal. It dulls our response to things we might otherwise question. That's why repetition is a core tactic in authoritarian messaging and misinformation campaigns. Not because it's persuasive on its own, but because hearing it enough times makes it feel like background truth. The line between influence and manipulation often lies in intent. Is repetition helping someone understand, or trying to make them stop thinking? Is it being used to support clarity, or to quietly overwhelm resistance? We can't stop repetition from shaping us. It's built into how we learn. But we can become more aware of what we're allowing to echo in our minds. Which messages do you hear most often, and are they serving you? Sometimes it's worth repeating things that are actually good for us. Things that strengthen us, that calm us, that help us remember who we are. Because repetition isn't just a tool, it's a mirror. And what we repeat, we start to believe. False consensus. It's the tendency to believe that our own thoughts, beliefs, and behaviors are more widely shared than they actually are. In other words, we assume that other people see the world the way we do, or at least that most people do. If we enjoy a certain type of music, we assume it's popular. If we hold a political view or a moral stance, we may take it as a given that it's common sense. It makes life feel more predictable, more familiar. But often it's just a projection, not a reflection of reality. This is known in psychology as the false consensus effect, a type of cognitive bias. It was first studied in the 1970s by social psychologist Lee Ross and his colleagues. In one of their experiments, participants were asked whether they would agree to wear a sandwich board sign that said, "Eat at Joe's" around campus. After making their choice, each participant was then asked how many others they thought would make the same choice. And no matter what decision they made, whether they said yes or no, most people believed that others would do the same. Their own choice became the lens through which they judged the majority. This bias doesn't just affect opinions, it influences judgment, memory, and behavior. We tend to remember examples that confirm our views and forget those that don't. We interpret neutral information as supporting our perspective, and we sometimes misjudge how controversial or unique our beliefs really are. This can lead to social friction, especially when different groups live in different information bubbles. People may struggle to understand how others could not see what seems obvious to them. It's especially common when we feel emotionally attached to our views. In moments of moral certainty about justice, values, or identity, we may instinctively assume, surely most people feel this way. But that assumption can create blind spots. It makes it harder to listen, harder to empathize, and harder to acknowledge that multiple truths can coexist, even when they contradict each other. False consensus also shows up in persuasion and influence. Salespeople might say, everyone's upgrading to this model, or most people in your situation choose this option. Politicians often use phrases like, the people have spoken, even when opinions are deeply divided. These kinds of statements aren't always lies, but they are designed to suggest a majority, to create a feeling of momentum. Because as social creatures, we're more likely to align ourselves with what we believe is popular, accepted, or expected. Digital life deepens the illusion. Online, we are often surrounded by people who think and speak like us, not because we sought it out, but because algorithms quietly shaped our environment. Over time, that creates a false social mirror, one that reflects back only the ideas we already agree with. It's comforting, but misleading. And when we do encounter disagreement, it can feel jarring or even offensive, not because it's hostile, but because it simply breaks the illusion that everyone thinks like me. Being aware of the false consensus effect doesn't mean doubting yourself. It means expanding your lens. It means asking, could there be more views I haven't considered, or what might this look like from someone else's point of view? The more we ask these questions, the more flexible and grounded our thinking becomes. Not everyone sees the world the same way. And that's not a threat. It's a chance to learn, connect, and grow. In a way, stepping outside of false consensus brings us closer to truth, not because we find the one right answer, but because we start to see how many perspectives can exist side by side. Pacing and leading. Pacing and leading is a powerful psychological technique used in communication to build rapport, establish trust, and gently guide someone's thoughts, feelings, or actions. It's a subtle dance of matching another person's current experience, their emotions, beliefs, or behaviors, and then slowly inviting them to move toward a new perspective or response. This method respects the natural flow of interaction and helps influence without force or resistance. The concept of pacing and leading has its roots in fields like hypnosis and neuro-linguistic programming, NLP, but its principles apply broadly in everyday life, from therapy and coaching to sales and leadership. The process begins with pacing, which means tuning in closely to the other person's current state. This can be done by mirroring their body language, matching the tone and rhythm of their speech, or acknowledging their feelings and thoughts in a way that feels genuine. Pacing signals, I see you. I understand where you are right now. For example, if someone is feeling upset and speaks in a quiet, slow voice, pacing would involve lowering your own voice and slowing your speech to match their emotional tempo. Or, if a colleague is enthusiastic and energetic, pacing might involve showing excitement and enthusiasm in return. By pacing, you create a sense of connection and safety. The other person feels heard and accepted, which lowers their defenses and opens them up to engagement. Once the pacing phase has established rapport, the next step is leading. Leading means gradually guiding the person toward a new idea, feeling, or behavior. Because you have already aligned yourself with their current state, your suggestions or shifts in tone are more likely to be welcomed rather than resisted. You might gently introduce a more positive frame, a calming influence, or a constructive course of action. Take the earlier example of someone feeling anxious. After pacing their anxiety by acknowledging how tough the moment is, You might lead them by suggesting a simple relaxation technique. Let's take a slow breath together. Over time, with continued pacing and leading, you can help shift their emotional state from anxiety to calmness. The change feels natural and collaborative rather than forced. This technique works because of a fundamental human need to feel understood before we can be influenced. Pacing meets that need by creating rapport and trust. Leading then leverages that trust to encourage new perspectives or behaviors. It respects autonomy. The person is never coerced but invited to follow. Pacing and leading isn't limited to emotional states. It can also be applied to beliefs, attitudes, or decisions. For instance, a skilled negotiator might first pace a client's concerns and doubts by reflecting them accurately. Then, step by step, the negotiator leads the client to consider alternative options or solutions. Because the process begins with genuine understanding, resistance is minimized. However, it's important to be mindful in using pacing and leading. If the pacing feels insincere or like mimicry, it can backfire and cause distrust. People are sensitive to authenticity, so pacing must be heartfelt. Likewise, leading should be subtle and gradual. Abrupt or forceful attempts to guide someone's thoughts or actions can feel manipulative or controlling. The power of pacing and leading lies in its respectful, empathetic approach. In practice, pacing and leading is a skill anyone can develop. It begins with attentive listening and observation, noticing how someone expresses themselves, what they value, and how they respond. It requires patience as the leading part unfolds gently over time rather than demanding immediate change. The benefits of pacing and leading extend beyond influence. It improves communication, deepens relationships, and fosters emotional safety. When we pace others, we validate their experience. When we lead with care, we inspire growth. Together, pacing and leading create a collaborative environment where change happens naturally and comfortably. In summary, pacing and leading is about connection before direction. It's about stepping into another's experience, meeting them there, and inviting them forward with empathy. Whether you're helping a friend through a tough time, negotiating a deal, or leading a team, pacing and leading offers a respectful and effective way to influence. One that honors the autonomy and dignity of everyone involved. Projection. Projection is a psychological defense mechanism where a person unconsciously attributes their own unwanted thoughts, feelings, or motives onto someone else. In simpler terms, it's like seeing in others what we don't want to recognize in ourselves. This process happens without our awareness, and it helps protect our self-image by externalizing uncomfortable inner experiences. Imagine feeling angry but being uncomfortable admitting it to yourself. Instead of acknowledging your own anger, you might accuse someone else of being angry or hostile towards you. By projecting your feelings onto another person, you create psychological distance from what's troubling you internally. This defense keeps anxiety or guilt at bay, at least temporarily. Projection is a common and natural part of how our minds manage difficult emotions. Sigmund Freud first described it as part of the broader unconscious defense system, helping people avoid painful truths or internal conflicts. But while it can shield us from distress, projection can also distort our view of reality and relationships. For example, in a conflict, someone who feels jealous may accuse their partner of jealousy without realizing they are the one experiencing those feelings. Or a person who is feeling insecure about their own honesty might frequently accuse others of lying or deceit. These projections can cause misunderstandings, resentment, and even damage trust, because the person projecting is not fully aware of what's happening inside themselves. Psychologists also note that projection often reflects deeper unconscious fears or desires. Sometimes, the traits we project onto others are qualities we secretly admire but feel unable to express in ourselves. Other times, projection reveals unresolved inner conflicts or past experiences that influence how we see the world. Projection can be subtle and hard to detect because it happens beneath conscious awareness. It often shows up in everyday interactions, in arguments, social judgments, or even self-talk. Someone might say they don't like me, when in fact they themselves feel disliked or unworthy. Or they might interpret neutral behaviors as hostile, reflecting their own fears rather than the other person's intentions. In relationships, projection can be especially challenging. When both people project onto each other, it creates a cycle of misunderstanding and blame. Each partner's fears and insecurities get mirrored back, making it difficult to communicate honestly or resolve conflict. Therapists often work with clients to recognize their projections and take responsibility for their own feelings, which can improve self-awareness and relationship health. Projection isn't always negative. It can also be a starting point for self-discovery. By paying attention to what qualities or emotions we attribute to others, we can learn more about what's going on inside ourselves. For example, if you notice yourself frequently accusing others of being critical, it might be worth exploring whether you're judging yourself harshly. This kind of insight can lead to greater emotional growth and healing. However, projection becomes problematic when it's rigid, excessive, or used to avoid accountability. When someone refuses to recognize their own faults and constantly blames others, it blocks personal development and damages trust. It's also common in manipulative behaviors where projection is used intentionally to confuse or control others. Awareness is the first step in working with projection. Mindfulness practices, therapy, and honest self-reflection can help us see when we might be projecting. The more we understand this process, the better we can separate our feelings from others, respond with empathy, and communicate more clearly. In summary, projection is an unconscious psychological process that shifts our own feelings, motives, or traits onto others. While it can protect us from difficult emotions, it can also create misunderstandings and conflict. Recognizing projection offers an opportunity for greater self-awareness, emotional insight, and healthy relationships. False urgency. False urgency is a psychological tactic to rush or pressure people into making quick decisions by creating the illusion that they have very little time to act. Unlike scarcity, which emphasizes limited availability or supply, false urgency focuses specifically on time constraints, the feeling that if you don't act immediately, you'll lose out on a special deal or opportunity. This technique leverages one of our brain's most powerful triggers, the fear of missing out, or FOMO. When we perceive that time is running out, our brains switch from deliberate thinking to a more reactive mode. This rush response often bypasses logical evaluation, pushing us toward impulsive decisions. Advertisers, salespeople, and sometimes even manipulative individuals use false urgency to short-circuit our critical thinking and prompt immediate compliance. For example, you might see online offers that flash messages like "Hurry, sale ends in 5 minutes." Or "Limited time offer. Act now." Even if the sale period is actually longer or repeats regularly, the ticking clock effect makes us feel we must act right now or lose the chance entirely. This artificially induced pressure can lead to buyer's remorse, as decisions made under false urgency are often not fully thought through. False urgency is also used outside of sales. In workplace settings, managers or coworkers might insist that certain tasks are urgent without real deadlines, increasing stress and coercing faster results. In personal relationships, someone may pressure their partner to make quick commitments or decisions to avoid discussion or resistance. What makes false urgency especially effective and manipulative is how it preys on human cognitive biases. The present bias, for instance, causes us to favor immediate rewards or relief over long-term benefits. When under time pressure, we often prioritize short-term gains or relief from stress, rather than considering all consequences. Another key factor is stress and anxiety. Time pressure elevates stress hormones like cortisol, which impair higher-level thinking and problem-solving. This makes us more susceptible to suggestion and less able to evaluate options critically. Not all urgency is false or bad. True emergencies or genuinely limited time offers do require quick action and can be helpful in driving necessary decisions. The problem arises when urgency is manufactured, when deadlines are arbitrary or repeatedly extended, and the pressure is purely a sales tactic or manipulative strategy. To protect yourself from false urgency, it's useful to pause and ask, is this really urgent? Can I take time to think it through? Often, simply slowing down breaks the spell of the ticking clock and reveals the true nature of the situation. Looking for clear deadlines, verifying the offer, and being aware of your emotional state can help you resist impulsive choices. Ethically, those who use urgency should be transparent about deadlines and limitations. When urgency is genuine and clearly communicated, it can be motivating without causing unnecessary stress or deception. In summary, false urgency is a psychological tool that creates artificial time pressure to push quick decisions. By understanding how it triggers fear, stress, and cognitive biases, you can make more thoughtful choices and avoid manipulation. Bait and switch. Imagine scrolling through your favorite online shopping app late at night when you come across an incredible deal. A brand new smartphone at a jaw-dropping price, hundreds of dollars off the usual cost. It's labeled as a flash sale, available only for the next hour. Excited, you quickly add it to your cart, eager to grab the bargain. But when you try to check out, you get a message. Sorry, this item is out of stock. Instead, you're shown a similar smartphone model, but it's more expensive and lacks some of the features you wanted. You feel frustrated and a bit cheated. What just happened? You've just experienced what's called a bait and switch. Bait and switch is a manipulative sales tactic designed to lure customers with an attractive, often too good to be true offer. The bait. Once you bite, the seller then switches the offer to something less desirable or more costly. This switch can be subtle or blatant, but the common thread is that the initial attractive offer is either unavailable, misleading, or never truly intended to be fulfilled. This tactic preys on consumer psychology and human behavior in several ways. First, it leverages our natural desire for a good deal. When something looks like a bargain, especially with a limited time offer, it creates excitement and urgency. We want to seize the opportunity before it's gone, often without fully scrutinizing the details. Secondly, bait and switch exploits a cognitive bias known as the sunk cost fallacy. Once you've invested time, energy, or emotional anticipation into pursuing the initial offer, like searching for it, adding it to your cart, or imagining owning it, you're more likely to accept the substitute or upsell rather than walk away empty-handed. This bias makes it psychologically harder to disengage, even when the alternative is less appealing. In many cases, the bait might not be intentionally deceptive, but part of poor inventory management or overpromising. However, when done deliberately, bait and switch is a deceptive and unethical practice that undermines trust and damages relationships between businesses and customers. This tactic isn't limited to online shopping or retail stores. It can appear in job offers, real estate, dating, and even politics. For instance, a company might advertise a high-paying position with excellent perks, only to offer a lower salary or more demanding responsibilities once the candidate is on board. Or a politician may promise sweeping reforms during a campaign, but later switch to watered-down policies after election. In all cases, bait and switch manipulates expectations to gain initial interest or commitment. Legally, bait and switch is considered fraudulent and is banned or regulated in many countries under consumer protection laws. However, enforcement can be challenging, and variations of the tactic continue to appear in subtle forms. Online marketplaces, especially those with user-generated listings, can sometimes facilitate bait-and-switch scams, where sellers advertise popular items at low prices, but never intend to sell them at those terms. To protect yourself from falling victim to bait-and-switch, it's important to be a savvy consumer. Always verify the availability of the product or service before committing. Look for reviews, compare prices across trusted sellers, and read the fine print of any offers. Be cautious of deals that sound too good to be true. They often are. If you encounter a bait and switch, don't hesitate to question the seller, ask for clarifications, or walk away. Your time and trust are valuable. Awareness of bait and switch also helps you recognize similar patterns in everyday interactions. In relationships, for example, people might promise one thing, but behave differently once trust is established, subtly switching their behavior or intentions to suit their needs. Being alert to these shifts can help you set boundaries and maintain healthy relationships. In summary, bait and switch is a deceptive strategy that hooks people with an appealing offer, only to switch for something less favorable or more expensive. By understanding the psychological triggers it exploits and remaining vigilant, you can make better informed choices, avoid frustration, and protect your interests. Black and white thinking. Imagine a situation where you make a small mistake at work and suddenly you think, I'm a complete failure. Or in a relationship, a single disagreement leads you to believe, this relationship is doomed. This kind of thinking, where things are seen in extremes with no middle ground or nuance, is called black and white thinking. Black and white thinking, also known as all or nothing thinking or dichotomous thinking, is a cognitive distortion where people view situations, events, or people in binary terms: good or bad, success or failure, right or wrong. There's no room for complexity, shades of gray, or exceptions. It's as if the world is divided into extremes, and anything that doesn't fit perfectly into one side is ignored or dismissed. This type of thinking can be harmful because it simplifies reality in ways that aren't accurate and often fuels emotional distress. When you see things in extremes, it's easy to jump to negative conclusions or feel overwhelmed by the idea that a situation is entirely hopeless or perfect. For example, if you miss a deadline, black and white thinking might convince you that you're incompetent rather than recognizing that everyone makes mistakes sometimes. Psychologists identify black and white thinking as a common feature in several mental health conditions, including depression, anxiety, and borderline personality disorder. It can lead to patterns of self-criticism, frustration, and relationship conflicts, because it encourages rigid judgments that are hard to reconcile with real-life complexities. The origins of black and white thinking can stem from early experiences, cultural influences, or learned behaviors where things were presented as strictly right or wrong. It's also a coping mechanism that simplifies decision-making and reduces uncertainty by categorizing experiences clearly. However, this simplification comes at the cost of ignoring nuance and flexibility. One way black and white thinking manifests is in moral judgments. People might see others as either entirely good or entirely bad, based on single actions, ignoring the full context of human behavior. This rigid judgment can foster polarization, intolerance, and difficulties in empathy. Challenging black and white thinking involves developing cognitive flexibility, the ability to hold multiple perspectives and accept that most situations exist on a continuum. Techniques such as cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, often focus on identifying these all-or-nothing thoughts and replacing them with more balanced, realistic views. For example, instead of thinking, "I failed completely," you might reframe it as, "I made a mistake, but I can learn and improve." Instead of, "They never listen to me," you might consider, "Sometimes they listen, and sometimes they don't." By cultivating awareness of black and white thinking, you can reduce emotional distress and improve problem-solving skills. It allows you to see challenges as manageable and relationships as more nuanced and forgiving. In summary, black and white thinking is a cognitive distortion where situations are seen in extremes without middle ground. Recognizing and challenging this thinking style can help foster a more balanced, compassionate, and realistic perspective on life's complexities. Gradual desensitization. Imagine someone who has a deep fear of public speaking. The thought of standing in front of a crowd makes their heart race and palms sweat. But over time, by slowly exposing themselves to speaking in smaller, less intimidating settings, first to a close friend, then to a small group, and eventually to larger audiences, they begin to feel less anxious and more confident. This step-by-step process is an example of gradual desensitization. Gradual desensitization, sometimes called systematic desensitization, is a psychological technique used to reduce emotional responses, especially fear or anxiety, by slowly and repeatedly exposing a person to the source of their distress in a controlled, safe manner. This process helps the brain and body learn that the feared stimulus is not actually threatening, thereby diminishing the anxiety or negative reaction over time. The concept of gradual desensitization has its roots in classical conditioning, a foundational principle of behavioral psychology discovered by Ivan Pavlov in the early 20th century. Later, psychologists like Joseph Wolpe developed the technique as a way to treat phobias and anxiety disorders effectively. By pairing relaxation techniques with gradual exposure, patients could retrain their minds to respond calmly rather than with fear. Here's how gradual desensitization typically works. Relaxation training. The process usually starts with teaching relaxation methods, such as deep breathing, progressive muscle relaxation, or guided imagery. These techniques help the individual control their physiological responses, reducing tension and preparing them to face anxiety triggers without becoming overwhelmed. Creating a fear hierarchy. Next, the individual and therapist identify specific situations or stimuli related to the fear, ranked from least to most anxiety-provoking. For example, if someone fears flying, the hierarchy might start with thinking about booking a flight, then watching videos about airplanes, visiting an airport, boarding a plane, and finally flying. Gradual exposure. The individual is then gradually exposed to these situations, starting from the least frightening while practicing relaxation. Over repeated sessions, they move up the hierarchy at a pace that feels manageable. Each exposure helps reduce the anxiety linked to that specific trigger, eventually leading to diminished fear overall. Gradual desensitization isn't limited to phobias. It's also applied in treating post-traumatic stress disorder, PTSD, obsessive-compulsive disorder, OCD, and social anxiety. For example, someone with social anxiety might start by making brief eye contact with a stranger, then progress to small talk, attending social gatherings, and eventually giving a public speech. This systematic approach allows the person to build confidence and resilience without becoming overwhelmed. One of the key benefits of gradual desensitization is that it promotes habituation, a natural process where repeated exposure to a stimulus leads to a decrease in response. Over time, the emotional charge attached to the feared object or situation fades. The brain essentially learns that the situation is safe, breaking the cycle of avoidance and fear. However, the technique must be done thoughtfully and often under professional guidance. Rapid or forced exposure without proper preparation can backfire, increasing anxiety rather than reducing it. It's important to respect the individual's pace and comfort level to ensure gradual progress. Gradual desensitization also has applications beyond clinical therapy. For example, in marketing, some brands use exposure techniques to make consumers more comfortable with new products or ideas, reducing initial resistance. In education, gradual exposure to challenging tasks helps students build competence and confidence over time. Despite its effectiveness, there are ethical considerations when gradual desensitization is used outside therapeutic contexts. When applied manipulatively, it can desensitize people to negative behaviors or harmful situations, such as repeated exposure to violent media or toxic social environments, potentially dulling emotional responses in unhealthy ways. In summary, gradual desensitization is a powerful, evidence-based technique that helps reduce fear and anxiety through controlled, step-by-step exposure paired with relaxation. By gradually facing fears in a safe environment, individuals can rewire their responses, build confidence, and reclaim control over their emotional reactions. Whether used in therapy, education, or everyday life, this method highlights the brain's remarkable ability to adapt and heal. So, if you've ever found yourself avoiding something because of fear or discomfort, know that you don't have to conquer it all at once. Taking small, intentional steps at your own pace can lead to powerful change. Whether it's public speaking, social situations, or something deeply personal, gradual desensitization reminds us that progress is possible, one step at a time. Ingratiation. Imagine starting a new job and noticing that one of your co-workers always goes out of their way to compliment the boss. They laugh at every joke, agree with every opinion, and offer to stay late, often when others wouldn't. At first, it might seem like they're just friendly or polite. But over time, you start to wonder, is this sincere? Or are they trying to earn favor for personal gain? What you're witnessing could be a form of ingratiation. Ingratiation is a psychological and social strategy where a person deliberately tries to become more likable to another individual, often someone in a position of power, by using flattery, agreement, helpfulness, or self-presentation. The goal isn't always genuine connection. It's often to gain approval, rewards, influence, or protection. The concept was first studied in detail by psychologist Edward E. Jones in the 1960s. He described ingratiation as an intentional effort to control how others perceive you, usually by increasing your interpersonal appeal. It's not inherently manipulative, but the key difference lies in the motive. If the charm or kindness is a mask used solely to gain something, like a promotion, acceptance, or leniency, it shifts from social skill to social strategy. There are several common forms of ingratiation. Flattery. Complimenting someone's appearance, intelligence, or achievements, sometimes excessively to gain favor. Opinion conformity. Pretending to share the same views or values as someone else, even when you don't, in order to avoid disagreement. Self-deprecation. Downplaying one's abilities or achievements to seem humble or less threatening. Doing favors or offering help, not out of kindness but as a way to create a sense of obligation. Name-dropping or strategic association. Aligning yourself with influential figures to boost your own perceived status. Ingratiation is often subtle, making it hard to distinguish from genuine friendliness. In many social and professional settings, it's even rewarded. People who are likable often get better treatment, more opportunities, and higher social standing. This reinforces the behavior and normalizes it. In workplace dynamics, ingratiation can have significant consequences. Research shows that supervisors are more likely to reward employees who flatter or agree with them, even when their performance is average. It can create a culture where appearance and loyalty are valued more than honesty or skill, leading to unfairness and resentment. Ingratiation is also a powerful tool in politics, sales, and social media. Politicians may use carefully worded praise and charm to appeal to specific groups. Influencers may adapt their opinions to align with their audience for likes and shares. The line between authentic connection and strategic self-presentation becomes blurred. That said, ingratiation isn't always negative. In moderation and when done sincerely, it can help people navigate social environments, reduce conflict, and build rapport. Complimenting someone or agreeing with their ideas can be a sign of respect and emotional intelligence. But when it becomes a habitual strategic tool to manipulate perception, it loses authenticity and can erode trust. So, how can you tell when ingratiation is at play? Timing. Does the flattery come before a request? Consistency. Does the person behave the same way around everyone or only in front of authority? Authenticity. Do their compliments feel genuine or rehearsed and excessive? Being aware of ingratiation allows you to see beyond surface-level interactions. It can help you avoid being unduly influenced and also reflect on your own motives in social situations. So, if you've ever felt the pressure to win someone over by being overly agreeable or charming, take a moment to consider your why. Genuine connections grow from honesty and mutual respect, not from saying the right thing just to get ahead. By recognizing ingratiation in ourselves and others, we create space for more authentic, balanced relationships, where respect is earned, not engineered. Foot dragging. Imagine asking a coworker to complete a simple task, one that could be done in 10 minutes. They nod, say sure, and then nothing happens. Hours pass, days even. You follow up, and they give vague responses, "I'm getting to it," or "just been swamped." Eventually you start to wonder, are they really that busy or are they deliberately stalling? This subtle but powerful behavior is known as foot dragging. Foot dragging, sometimes referred to as deliberate delay or intentional stalling, is the act of slowing down progress on a task, not because of lack of ability or time, but as a way to resist, sabotage, or passively assert control. It's a common form of passive-aggressive behavior, where someone avoids direct confrontation by expressing resistance through inaction or delay. Unlike openly saying no, foot dragging allows someone to appear cooperative on the surface, while quietly withholding effort. It's resistance in disguise. Foot dragging often emerges in situations where there's a power imbalance, such as in workplaces, family dynamics, or institutions. Employees might use it when they feel overworked, unappreciated, or micromanaged. Teenagers might drag their feet when told to do chores they don't agree with. Even governments and large organizations use bureaucratic foot dragging to avoid making decisions they don't want to own. Psychologically, this behavior can serve several purposes, avoiding direct conflict. The person might fear confrontation or repercussions if they openly express disagreement, so they resist in more subtle ways. Regaining control. Delaying tasks can be a form of quiet protest, especially when someone feels powerless in a situation. Creating leverage. By slowing things down, the person may force others to compromise or give them more attention, help, or resources. Punishment or retaliation. In some cases, foot dragging is used to passively punish someone for a perceived slight or unfair treatment. The challenge with foot dragging is that it's plausibly deniable. If confronted, the person can always say they were busy, confused, or waiting on something else. This makes it hard to address directly, especially in professional environments. In group settings, foot dragging can derail productivity and erode trust. It puts strain on those who have to pick up the slack, and it often creates a cycle of frustration, miscommunication, and resentment. In personal relationships, it can become a subtle power struggle, where one partner constantly delays important conversations or decisions, leaving the other feeling ignored or invalidated. Addressing foot dragging requires clear communication and, when possible, creating accountability. It helps to focus on the pattern of delay rather than accusing someone of bad intent. For example, rather than saying, "You're doing this on purpose," try, "I've noticed this task keeps getting pushed back. Can we talk about what's making it hard to move forward?" It also helps to set clear deadlines, expectations, and follow-ups. Ambiguity gives foot dragging room to thrive. When roles and timelines are clearly defined, it becomes easier to recognize when someone is resisting through inaction. But it's not always about others. Sometimes we're the ones dragging our feet, putting off that difficult conversation, avoiding that decision, or endlessly delaying a project we don't want to face. In those moments, foot dragging can be a sign that we're feeling overwhelmed, unsure, or emotionally blocked. So, if you've been dragging your feet, whether at work, in a relationship, or on a personal goal, ask yourself what the delay is really about. Sometimes the slow pace is telling us something we haven't said out loud. And if someone else is dragging their feet with you, consider whether they need support, clarity, or just the space to be honest. Awareness is the first step to moving forward, one intentional step at a time. Double bind. Imagine your manager tells you, "I want you to take more initiative, but don't do anything without checking with me first." Or a parent says, "You're free to make your own decisions, but don't disappoint me." These are examples of a double bind, a situation where no matter what you do, you're wrong. And worse, questioning the situation only deepens the trap. A double bind is a psychological predicament in which a person receives two or more conflicting messages, and one message negates the other. It creates a scenario where responding to one demand automatically violates the other, leaving the person in a lose-lose situation. The more they try to resolve it, the more trapped they feel. The concept of the double bind was developed in the 1950s by anthropologist and social scientist Gregory Bateson, who studied paradoxical communication in families and its potential links to mental health, particularly schizophrenia. Bateson described how repeated exposure to double binds, especially in close relationships where escape isn't possible, can cause immense psychological stress, confusion, and anxiety. Double binds are especially damaging because there's no clear way out. Every available option leads to failure or criticism. Escape is discouraged or punished. You can't just walk away without consequences. The contradiction is often denied. If you point out the conflict, you're told you're overreacting or misunderstanding. Let's say a child is told, "Come give your aunt a hug." But when they hesitate, the parent adds, "What's wrong with you? Don't you love your family?" In this moment, the child is caught. If they hug their aunt, they're going against their own discomfort. If they don't, they're shamed for being cold. And if they try to explain, they're told they're being disrespectful. That's a classic double bind, and they can be found everywhere, in families, workplaces, romantic relationships, even politics and advertising. In relationships, double binds often show up as emotional manipulation. For example, a partner might say, "You should know what I need without me telling you. If I have to ask, it doesn't count." This creates an impossible expectation. You're supposed to be intuitive, but you're punished if you ask for clarity. In the workplace, double binds can paralyze employees. A manager might say, "I value creativity, but just make sure you don't make mistakes." So you're expected to innovate but not take risks. The result? Stress, second-guessing, and burnout. And socially, we hear double binds all the time. Be yourself, but don't be weird. Speak your truth, but don't offend anyone. These messages are confusing because they promote a value while simultaneously punishing its expression. What makes double binds especially toxic is the way they undermine confidence and distort perception. Over time, people subjected to repeated double binds may begin to doubt their own judgment, feel chronically anxious, or even internalize guilt for things they had no control over. They may learn to suppress their feelings or avoid decisions altogether, fearing that any choice could be wrong. Breaking free from a double bind starts with recognition. Spotting the contradiction is key. Once you can name the bind, you're no longer trapped in it unconsciously. The next step is setting boundaries and seeking clarification. Ask, which of these expectations is more important to you? Or can we talk about the mixed signals I'm getting? It's not always easy, but bringing the contradiction into the open is the only way to challenge it. So, if you've ever felt stuck between two impossible choices, where doing one thing means failing at another, you might be caught in a double bind. And if you've lived through enough of these, it's not your fault if you feel unsure or conflicted. The truth is, the problem isn't your reaction. It's the impossible expectations. Start by noticing them. Call them what they are. Because clarity is the first step toward freedom. Intermittent reinforcement. Imagine you're texting someone you're interested in. Sometimes they respond instantly, excited and engaged. Other times they disappear for hours or days, leaving your message on read. Just as you're about to give up, they send a charming reply that pulls you back in. That emotional roller coaster, that's not just inconsistency, that's intermittent reinforcement. And it's one of the most powerful psychological patterns out there. Intermittent reinforcement refers to the process of delivering rewards or positive responses on an unpredictable schedule. Instead of reinforcing behavior every time it happens, the reinforcement comes only occasionally, and often without warning. What makes this so powerful is the uncertainty. The brain learns that if it just holds out long enough, that reward will eventually come. This creates a strong emotional and behavioral attachment that's much harder to break than if the reward were consistent. The concept comes from the work of psychologist B.F. Skinner, who explored reinforcement schedules in the 20th century. In his experiments with rats and pigeons, Skinner found that when a reward, like food, was given inconsistently, sometimes after one action, sometimes after 10, the subjects pressed the lever far more persistently than when the reward came every time. It was the unpredictability that made the behavior stick. Sound familiar? That's because intermittent reinforcement shows up in many parts of our lives. Gambling is built on this principle. Slot machines don't pay out every time, but when they do, the rush is intense. That rare win keeps people playing far beyond reason. Toxic relationships often use this pattern whether consciously or not. One moment, everything is affectionate and thrilling. The next, distant and cold. The unpredictability keeps one partner emotionally hooked, hoping the warmth will return. Social media thrives on this too. You don't get a like or a comment every time you post, but when you do, it triggers a small dopamine reward. That hit of validation keeps you scrolling, checking, and posting again. Parenting or workplace dynamics can unintentionally create intermittent reinforcement. If a child is only sometimes praised or a boss inconsistently rewards good work, the uncertainty can make people work harder, yet more anxiously, to chase approval. The real issue with intermittent reinforcement is that it strengthens attachment while increasing emotional dependency. The person or behavior being reinforced becomes more important, even though it's less reliable. In romantic or interpersonal relationships, this can mimic the cycles of abuse, with short bursts of affection reinforcing longer stretches of neglect or mistreatment. Victims often find themselves staying convinced that the next good moment is just around the corner. Psychologically, this taps into something deep. Our brains are wired to seek patterns, especially those tied to reward. When we can't predict the reward, we pay more attention, we obsess, we hope, and that hope becomes addictive. So how do you break free from a cycle of intermittent reinforcement? It starts with recognition. Notice the pattern, not just the highs, but the long stretches of silence or stress in between. Ask yourself, am I staying because this is healthy and consistent, or because I'm chasing the next good moment? The next step is consistency, from yourself and in what you expect from others. Set clear boundaries, value reliability over intensity. Whether it's in friendships, dating, or your habits online, learn to identify situations where the unpredictability is keeping you hooked, not happy. So if you find yourself returning again and again to something or someone that only occasionally gives you what you need, take a step back. It might not be love, luck, or even interest keeping you there. It might just be the pattern of intermittent reinforcement. And once you see it for what it is, you can stop chasing uncertainty and start choosing stability. Social exclusion. Imagine walking into a room full of people talking and laughing, and the moment they see you, the energy shifts. Their smiles fade, the conversation quiets, and no one makes eye contact. You stand there feeling invisible. You weren't insulted. No one said anything outright. But somehow you've been shut out. That is the quiet but powerful force of social exclusion. Social exclusion, also known as ostracism, is the experience of being deliberately left out, ignored, or pushed to the margins of a group. Unlike overt bullying or criticism, exclusion is often silent. There's no confrontation, just absence. Absence of attention, inclusion, invitation, or acknowledgement. And as subtle as it may seem, it can be one of the most painful psychological experiences a person can go through. Why does it hurt so much? Because as human beings, we are wired for connection. Belonging to a group has always been essential to our survival. From early tribal societies to modern teams, communities, and families, our brains are built to seek inclusion. It's not just emotional, it's biological. Neuroscience research shows that when we're socially excluded, the same regions of the brain that register physical pain, like the anterior cingulate cortex, are activated. In other words, being ignored or excluded doesn't just feel bad. It literally hurts. And unlike physical wounds, the ache of exclusion can linger, becoming chronic, shaping our thoughts, behavior, and self-worth over time. Social exclusion can happen in countless ways. In school, it might look like a group of classmates not inviting someone to sit with them. In the workplace, it could be being left off important emails or meetings. Online, it might be watching friends make plans without you, or noticing likes and comments flood everyone else's posts except yours. It doesn't always require intention. Sometimes exclusion is subtle, even unconscious. But the result is the same, feeling unimportant, invisible, or unwanted. And the effects go deep. Social exclusion can lead to increased levels of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and self-doubt. It can damage a person's sense of identity and belonging, leaving them questioning what they did wrong, even if they did nothing at all. People who are excluded repeatedly may begin to withdraw from others, assuming rejection is inevitable. They may also become more sensitive to criticism or more eager to please, constantly scanning for signs of disapproval. Psychologist Kip Williams, a leading researcher in this field, conducted a now famous experiment called cyberball. In the study, participants thought they were playing an online ball-tossing game with others. At first, everyone was included equally. But after a few tosses, the participant was no longer passed the ball. Even though it was just a simple animation, people reported feeling rejected, hurt, and excluded. That's how quickly and deeply the sting of being left out can settle in, even in a virtual game. In more serious cases, long-term social exclusion can contribute to radicalization, self-harm, or aggressive behavior, as individuals seek alternative ways to reclaim a sense of power, identity, or connection. That's why understanding this experience isn't just about sensitivity, it's about recognizing a key driver of human behavior. Social exclusion doesn't always come from strangers. It can come from loved ones, through the silent treatment, being left on read, or being excluded from decisions or moments that matter. These small social cues, what psychologists call micro-rejections, can build up over time, creating emotional wounds that are hard to heal. So how do we cope with social exclusion? First, it's important to recognize it for what it is. Sometimes we internalize the experience. We think, maybe I'm just not good enough. But often, exclusion says more about the group than the individual. It can be driven by groupthink, fear, jealousy, or even simple oversight. Next, build relationships where you're genuinely seen and valued. Even one true connection can act as a buffer against the pain of exclusion. Research shows that the quality of relationships, not the quantity, is what protects our mental health. It's also important to reconnect with yourself. When we're excluded, we often lose sight of who we are. Take time to revisit your values, your interests, and your strengths. Reaffirm your worth from the inside out. And if you've ever excluded someone, intentionally or not, it's never too late to reach out. A simple acknowledgement, an invitation, or a moment of listening can make a huge difference. Sometimes healing begins with just being noticed. So if you've ever felt left out, overlooked, or pushed aside, know this: your worth isn't defined by who does or doesn't include you. It's defined by your capacity to show up, to care, and to keep reaching for connection. Even when it's hard, you belong, even when others forget to show it. And sometimes the strongest bonds are found not in fitting in, but in finding those who see you fully, just as you are. Microaffirmations. Have you ever had a conversation with someone who just made you feel seen? Maybe they nodded while you spoke. Maybe they gave you a quick smile or said something small like, "Good point," or "I never thought of it that way." You probably walked away from that interaction feeling a little more confident, a little more heard, and maybe without even realizing why. That's not a coincidence. It's the quiet power of something called microaffirmations. Tiny, often unconscious signals that communicate encouragement, validation, and respect. They're subtle, they're often unnoticed, but over time they can shape the way we think, feel, and interact with others, and even how we see ourselves. Microaffirmations are the opposite of microaggressions. While microaggressions are those small slights or dismissive comments that chip away at someone's confidence, microaffirmations quietly build someone up. They're small, simple acts, a nod, a smile, a short phrase like "I see your point," but they create a ripple effect that can influence mood, behavior, and even performance. The term was coined by Mary Rowe, a professor at MIT, who wanted to describe these everyday signals that help people feel included. And while they may sound like common courtesy, research shows their effect goes much deeper. Microaffirmations work because our brains are wired to pick up on subtle social cues. We're constantly scanning our environment for signs. Do I belong here? Am I being heard? Am I respected? Microaffirmations speak directly to those questions, often without a single word needing to be spoken. Imagine you're in a meeting. You share an idea, and your manager turns to you, nods, and says, "Interesting, let's build on that." That's a microaffirmation. Now imagine you speak again in the next meeting, and this time they barely look up. Over time, those small responses, or the lack of them, shape your experience. You may not consciously recognize it, but your confidence begins to adjust accordingly. You either feel encouraged and more likely to contribute again, or a little more hesitant, unsure, quiet. Microaffirmations influence more than just confidence. They affect behavior. They determine who participates, who feels safe to speak, and who feels invisible. In classrooms, for example, studies have found that teachers often give more eye contact, smiles, or verbal nods to certain students, and usually not intentionally. But those students who consistently receive microaffirmations tend to be more engaged, more confident, and more successful. The others, not so much. The power of these subtle signals is also seen in the workplace. Let's say there are two employees, Sarah and James. Sarah shares an idea and gets a brief, warm, "Great thought, we'll explore that." James shares a different idea and gets no response at all. Nothing negative, just silence or a quick move to the next topic. Over time, Sarah may feel more empowered and valued. James might begin to question his role, his value, and whether anyone is even listening. What's important to understand is that these moments usually aren't about favoritism or malice. In many cases, they happen unconsciously, often influenced by bias, the kind we don't even realize we carry. That's where intentional microaffirmations come in. By actively choosing to include small gestures of recognition across all interactions, especially with people who are often overlooked, we help to balance the scales. We create spaces that feel more equitable, more supportive, more human. And the effect doesn't stop with one person. Microaffirmations are contagious. When someone feels heard, they're more likely to listen to others. When they feel valued, they're more likely to show appreciation. These small acts of affirmation create a feedback loop, one that builds trust, openness, and connection. So how can you start using microaffirmations more consciously? It doesn't take much. Say someone's name when you greet them. Make eye contact when someone's talking. Echo back something someone said that made an impact. A simple, "That's a great observation," or "Thanks for sharing that," goes a long way. These gestures may seem small, and they are. but their influence compounds over time. In a world where so much of our communication is rushed, distracted, or filtered through screens, microaffirmations bring us back to something deeply human: the need to be acknowledged, to feel that we matter, to know that someone is truly present with us, even for just a moment. So the next time you're in a meeting or a conversation, or even just passing by someone, notice what you're signaling. A small nod, a warm word, a second of eye contact. These are the microaffirmations that quietly shape lives. And when you give them, you're not just changing someone else's day. You're also reminding yourself of the kind of presence you want to bring into the world. One built not on grand gestures, but on the quiet power of being kind, being aware, and being human. Mimetic desire. Have you ever wanted something, not because you really needed it or even thought about it much, but because someone else wanted it first? Maybe it was a pair of shoes that suddenly looked better once your friend bought them. Maybe it was a job that didn't seem exciting, until you heard other people fighting to get it. Or maybe it was a relationship, an opinion, even a lifestyle. And what made it so desirable wasn't the thing itself, but the desire surrounding it. That's not just envy, that's mimetic desire. And it's one of the most powerful yet invisible forces shaping our behavior. The term mimetic comes from the Greek word mimesis, meaning imitation. And mimetic desire is the idea that we don't desire things independently. We desire what others desire. We mirror the longings, goals, and preferences of the people around us, often without realizing we're doing it. This concept was developed by French philosopher and anthropologist René Girard, who believed that imitation goes far deeper than style, speech, or gestures. According to Girard, imitation extends into the realm of desire itself. In other words, we learn what to want by watching others. Think about it for a second. Desire doesn't arise in a vacuum. Most of the time, it isn't born purely from internal logic or need. We see someone else chasing something, valuing something, needing something, and suddenly, it lights up for us too. Not because we analyzed it, but because someone else's attention made it glow. This is especially true in childhood. Watch a group of kids in a room full of toys. One child picks up a toy that no one seemed interested in. Almost instantly, that toy becomes the most valuable object in the room. Why? Because a peer's desire has elevated its status. That's mimetic desire in its purest form, and it doesn't go away with age. Adults do the same thing. We see it in social media trends, stock market bubbles, fashion crazes, influencer marketing, and romantic competition. It's not always the thing that's valuable. It's the attention around the thing that generates value. Now here's where it gets complicated. If two people want the same thing for the same reason, they become rivals. Not necessarily enemies, but competitors. Girard suggested that mimetic desire leads to conflict because we don't just imitate desires. We imitate them toward limited objects. One promotion, one partner, one spotlight. And when multiple people chase the same goal, the competition intensifies, often irrationally. This doesn't just play out in individuals. Entire social groups, even nations, can fall into mimetic conflict. Historical feuds, political polarization, and culture wars often stem from groups adopting each other's desires in opposition, mirroring each other while pretending to be complete opposites. Ironically, we're more likely to be influenced by people close to us, friends, colleagues, siblings, than by strangers. The people we compare ourselves to most intensely are often those we consider similar. Mimetic desire feeds off proximity. We're not usually jealous of billionaires. We're jealous of the person in our field, our age group, or our friend circle, because their desire feels reachable, relevant, and more threatening. But here's the twist. Mimetic desire isn't inherently bad. In fact, it's essential to learning. We imitate to grow. Children model their parents. Artists model masters. Entrepreneurs model innovators. Desire, when modeled with intention, can inspire us to reach higher. The danger comes when we don't realize we're doing it, when we believe our desires are totally our own, while they're actually being shaped, even manipulated by what others pursue. Social media accelerates this process dramatically. We see curated lives, filtered aspirations, viral products, and public praise, all signaling what we should want. Platforms like Instagram, TikTok, and LinkedIn are mimetic engines, driving desire by showing us what's hot, what's scarce, and what's admired. And the more something is seen as desired, the more it actually becomes desirable, regardless of whether it aligns with our real needs or values. So, how do we protect ourselves? How do we tell if what we want is truly ours, or just borrowed from someone else's longing? The first step is awareness. Ask yourself, where did this desire come from? Who models this goal for me? What do I believe it will give me, and is that belief my own? The second step is clarity. Define your values. Not just what looks good or what wins approval, but what really fulfills you. Desires aligned with values tend to bring peace. Mimetic desires often bring restlessness, comparison, and confusion. And finally, practice detachment. Just because someone else wants it doesn't mean you need to. You can admire someone's path without copying it. You can witness someone's success without mirroring their ambition. Mimetic desire is strongest when we feel unsure about our identity. Strengthening that identity is the best way to stop chasing what others chase, just because they're chasing it. At the end of the day, desire is not just a spark, it's a signal, a reflection of where we're looking and who we're looking at. Mimetic desire is part of being human, but when we become conscious of it, we can choose which desires to follow and which to leave behind. Because the question isn't just what do you want, it's who showed you how to want it. Mood repair strategies. Have you ever noticed how sometimes when you're feeling down or stressed, you immediately reach for something that makes you feel better? Maybe it's listening to your favorite song, calling a close friend, or even eating a comfort food. These are more than just habits. They're examples of what psychologists call mood repair strategies. Mood repair is the process by which people actively try to change their emotional state to improve their mood, calm anxiety, or regain a sense of balance. It's a deeply human instinct, something we all do, consciously or unconsciously, whenever life's ups and downs hit us. But here's the interesting part. Mood repair isn't just about feeling better individually. It's also a social and psychological tool, a way we influence ourselves and sometimes even the people around us. Let's dive deeper into what mood repair strategies really are, how they work, and why they matter so much in our lives. What is mood repair? At its core, mood repair is about emotional self-regulation. It's how we manage feelings like sadness, anger, fear, or disappointment by shifting our mental or physical state. There are countless ways we do this. Some are positive and healthy, like taking a walk, practicing mindfulness, or talking through our feelings with someone we trust. Others can be less helpful, like binge-watching TV to avoid problems, overeating, or excessive drinking. The effectiveness of mood repair depends on the strategy and context. Positive mood repair can build resilience, improve well-being, and even strengthen relationships. Negative mood repair, however, can trap people in cycles of avoidance or unhealthy habits. How do we choose our mood repair strategies? Humans are naturally motivated to feel good. Neuroscience tells us that our brains are wired to seek pleasure and avoid pain. When emotions dip, we instinctively look for ways to bring ourselves back to baseline. But how do we pick which strategy to use? There are several influences. Past experience. If you found certain activities help you feel better before, you're likely to repeat them. Personality. Some people prefer solitude and reflection, others seek social connection. Environment. What's accessible in the moment matters, whether that's a walk outside or a phone to call a friend. Social norms. Culture shapes which mood repair strategies are acceptable or encouraged. Awareness. Being mindful of your emotional state can guide you toward more effective repair methods. The power of positive mood repair. Positive mood repair strategies don't just soothe emotions, they can actively change brain chemistry. For example, exercise releases endorphins, the so-called feel-good chemicals. Connecting with loved ones boosts oxytocin, which promotes bonding and calm. Research shows that using healthy mood repair strategies consistently can reduce the risk of depression and anxiety, improve emotional resilience, enhance problem-solving skills, strengthen social bonds, increase overall life satisfaction. One classic example is cognitive reappraisal, changing the way you think about a situation to alter its emotional impact. Instead of thinking, "I failed completely," reframing to, "This is a chance to learn and improve," can make a huge difference in mood and motivation. When mood repair becomes manipulative. Mood repair can also be used, sometimes intentionally, to influence others. This happens often in social or professional settings. For example, a colleague might share a personal story to elicit sympathy and steer a conversation. A friend might use humor to lighten the mood and avoid conflict. These are subtle ways of managing group emotions and dynamics. But mood repair can cross into manipulation if it's used to control others emotionally, evade responsibility, or distort reality. Consider someone who repeatedly uses tears to avoid accountability. This is a mood repair strategy that creates emotional pressure, but it's not genuine self-regulation. Or someone who constantly seeks reassurance in ways that drain others. Recognizing these patterns helps us set boundaries and respond thoughtfully rather than reactively. Mood repair in media and marketing. Marketers and media creators also use mood repair principles, often subtly. Have you noticed how advertisements often show happy, relaxing scenes, families smiling, friends laughing, serene landscapes? These images tap into our desire to feel good, implicitly promising that the product will help us repair our mood. Streaming platforms suggest feel-good movies when you're down. Music apps curate playlists designed to boost your mood or help you unwind. This isn't accidental. Mood repair is a powerful motivator for attention, engagement, and purchase decisions. How to use mood repair strategies intentionally. The good news is, mood repair is a skill you can develop. Here are some tips to make your mood repair healthier and more effective. Increase awareness. Check in with yourself regularly. What are you feeling? What do you need right now? Build a toolbox. Identify a range of mood repair strategies that work for you, from deep breathing to creative outlets. Practice mindfulness. Being present helps you notice emotional shifts early and respond thoughtfully. Connect. Seek support when needed. Social connection is one of the most powerful mood repair strategies. Avoid escape. Try not to use mood repair as a way to avoid problems or responsibilities. Healthy repair is about emotional balance, not denial. Reflect. After mood repair, take a moment to assess if the strategy helped or if you need to try something else. Final thoughts. The role of mood repair in everyday life. Mood repair strategies are part of what makes us human. They help us bounce back from setbacks, manage stress, and find joy. They also shape our social interactions, culture, and even consumer behavior. By understanding how mood repair works and by choosing strategies consciously, we can improve our mental health, deepen our relationships, and navigate life's challenges with greater grace. So the next time you notice a shift in your mood, pay attention. That impulse to reach for comfort is more than just habit. It's your mind's way of healing itself. Use it wisely, and it can be one of your greatest tools for well-being. Gish Gallop. Have you ever found yourself in a debate or argument where the other person rapidly fires off a long list of claims, arguments, or facts so quickly that you barely have time to process them before the next point comes along? You try to respond, but before you finish, they've moved on to yet another statement, leaving you feeling overwhelmed and unable to effectively rebut any of them. This frustrating experience is caused by a technique known as the Gish Gallop. The term Gish Gallop is named after Duane Gish, a biochemist and prominent creationist debater, who famously used this rapid-fire strategy to overwhelm opponents during debates on evolution and creationism. It's a form of rhetorical strategy where a person floods the discussion with as many arguments, half-truths, misleading facts, or irrelevant points as possible, delivered at such a speed that the opponent simply cannot address each claim within the allotted time. The main goal is not necessarily to prove the argument correct, but to create the illusion of having a strong position by sheer volume of claims. At its core, the Gish Gallop exploits a fundamental asymmetry in argumentation. It takes much more time and effort to refute a single false or misleading claim than it does to make it. For example, someone might make a quick, unsupported assertion in just a few seconds. However, explaining why it's wrong could require minutes or even hours of detailed explanation and evidence. By overwhelming the opponent with dozens of such claims in rapid succession, the Gish Galloper forces them into an impossible situation. Responding to every point would take far longer than the time available. So many arguments go unaddressed. This tactic is effective not because the claims are strong, but because it puts the opponent on the defensive, and strains their ability to respond thoughtfully. The audience watching may not be able to fact-check every claim on the spot, and can easily be left with the impression that the person using the Gish Gallop must be winning, simply because of the sheer number of arguments presented. This is especially problematic in formats with strict time limits, such as televised debates, panel discussions, or social media threads. The Gish Gallop can be broken down into several key characteristics. Quantity over quality. Instead of focusing on the depth or strength of a few points, the strategy is to throw as many points as possible, regardless of their validity. Speed. Points are delivered rapidly, with minimal explanation or evidence, making it difficult for listeners or opponents to process. Difficulty in rebuttal. Because each claim requires time to analyze and refute properly, the sheer number overwhelms the opponent. Selective attention. The Gish Galloper may rely on the fact that their opponent can only respond to a handful of points, so the unaddressed claims linger in the audience's mind. This technique is not confined to academic or philosophical debates. It's increasingly common in political discussions, online arguments, and even marketing or public relations tactics. In politics, for instance, a candidate might deploy a rapid-fire barrage of accusations or misleading statistics to confuse opponents and muddy the waters for voters. On social media platforms where conversations unfold rapidly and fact-checking is difficult, Gish Galloping can create misinformation and hinder meaningful discourse. But why do people use the Gish Gallop, even if it's intellectually dishonest? Because it's effective. It's a way to dominate the conversation, control the narrative, and wear down opponents. It also exploits common cognitive biases. For example, many people equate the number of arguments with strength of position, even if those arguments lack merit. Additionally, the Gish Gallop can make the opponent seem evasive or weak if they don't address every claim. The best way to respond to a Gish Gallop isn't to try to respond to every claim. That's simply not feasible. Instead, there are several strategies that can help. Call out the tactic. Politely but firmly explain to the audience or the opponent that the rapid-fire listing of claims is designed to overwhelm and is not a productive way to have a reasoned discussion. This helps neutralize the effect and brings awareness to the tactic. Focus on key points. Identify one or two of the most important, central, or easily disproved claims and address those clearly and thoroughly. By doing this, you demonstrate critical thinking and provide the audience with concrete reasons to doubt the overall argument. Ask for clarification. Request that the opponent slow down and focus on a single claim at a time, with evidence and explanation. This puts the burden back on them to defend their points instead of just throwing them out rapidly. Avoid getting drawn into exhaustion. Recognize that you don't have to respond to every point to win a debate. Sometimes staying calm and selective is more effective than engaging with every single argument. Understanding the Gish Gallop is also important for critical thinking in everyday life. Whether you're watching a political debate, reading an article, or scrolling through social media, being aware of this technique helps you recognize when you're being overwhelmed with information that isn't necessarily reliable or truthful. It reminds us to slow down, verify claims, and not be swayed by the sheer volume of arguments alone. In summary, the Gish Gallop is a debate technique that overwhelms opponents with a rapid series of claims, making it difficult or impossible to respond to them all. It exploits the asymmetry in how quickly claims can be made versus how slowly they must be debunked. While it may appear impressive, it's fundamentally a tactic designed to confuse, frustrate, and dominate rather than enlighten. By learning to identify the Gish Gallop and employing smart responses, like calling it out, focusing on key arguments, and insisting on clarity, we can promote more honest and productive conversations. After all, quality always trumps quantity when it comes to meaningful debate. Third-person appeal. Have you ever noticed how some of the most persuasive messages don't talk to you directly, but somehow still feel personally relevant? Instead of saying, "You should do this," the message might say, "People in your situation often choose this path," or "Successful individuals tend to avoid this mistake." It might seem like the message is talking about someone else, but internally, something clicks. That subtle, almost invisible persuasion technique is known as the third-person appeal, and it works far more powerfully than it appears on the surface. Third-person appeal is a psychological strategy that communicates indirectly by referencing other people or general situations instead of directly addressing the listener. Rather than pointing a finger and saying, "You need to change," it takes a more observational tone. Many people find that when they change this one habit, things start improving. It creates a sense of psychological distance, a kind of safe space where the listener doesn't feel attacked or pressured. Yet ironically, that distance often draws people in closer. It allows them to reflect more honestly, to consider the message on their own terms, and to apply the insight inwardly without the usual resistance that direct advice often brings. This technique taps into a few fundamental aspects of human psychology. First, it bypasses our natural defenses. When someone speaks to us in second person, "You're doing this wrong," or "You should try this," our instinctive reaction might be to resist, argue, or shut down. But when the focus shifts to others, like some people find themselves stuck in this pattern, it's easier to stay open-minded. We don't feel personally criticized. Instead, we're invited to observe someone else. And in that moment of observation, we often begin to reflect, "Is that me?" That subtle shift from feeling judged to feeling curious is where the real influence begins. Second, third-person appeal leverages social comparison, something we do constantly and often without noticing. When we hear about how others behave, how others succeed or struggle, we can't help but measure ourselves against them. It's not that we want to imitate everyone, but we instinctively use other people's choices and experiences as mirrors. Even when the message isn't aimed at us, we apply it to ourselves. That's the psychological brilliance of this technique. It doesn't have to speak to us directly to make us listen. Third, this method feels familiar. In storytelling, journalism, advertising, and even education, third-person narrative is the default. We're conditioned to engage with messages told about others. Think about documentaries, self-help books, or TED Talks. They often include stories of a woman who struggled, or a man who learned the hard way, or a group of people who overcame something. These aren't just anecdotes, they're persuasive devices. The listener isn't forced to defend themselves or their beliefs. They're simply listening to a story and drawing their own conclusions along the way. You'll see third-person appeal everywhere once you start looking for it. In marketing, it's when the brand says, "Thousands have already switched and noticed the difference." In therapy, a counselor might say, "Some people in your situation find relief when they change their routine," instead of telling the client directly what to do. Even in parenting, instead of saying, "You always leave your toys out," a parent might say, "Sometimes kids forget to clean up, and then they lose their favorite pieces." The child isn't scolded, but they're guided towards self-awareness. Interestingly, this strategy is often confused with social proof, but it's not quite the same. Social proof says, "Everyone is doing it, so you should too." It relies on conformity. Third-person appeal is more nuanced. It says others like you have done this and seen results. It's not telling you to follow the crowd. It's inviting you to reflect on what might work for you based on a relatable story or pattern. And here's where it gets really interesting. Studies show that people often make wiser decisions when they think in the third person. Instead of asking, "What should I do?" they ask, "What should someone in my position do?" This mental distancing reduces emotional bias and helps people evaluate their situation more clearly. Third-person appeal activates this same mechanism. It allows listeners to think objectively, but feel personally connected. Of course, like any technique, it can be used ethically or manipulatively. There's a big difference between saying people who meditate often report feeling calmer and saying, "Real professionals don't need breaks." One is an invitation. The other is a veiled judgment. The line between guidance and manipulation depends on the speaker's intent. Used ethically, third-person appeal is a compassionate way to encourage growth, inspire self-awareness, and plant ideas that feel discovered rather than imposed. But used to shame, pressure, or control, it can be a subtle form of emotional coercion. Ultimately, third-person appeal reminds us that not all persuasion needs to be direct. Sometimes, the most powerful messages are the ones that don't talk to us head-on, but instead hold up a mirror through someone else's story. By shifting the frame of reference, this approach disarms defensiveness and sparks curiosity. And in that space between observation and self-reflection, people often find their own answers. So the next time you hear someone say, "Some people never realize the cost of waiting until it's too late," you might realize they're not just talking about someone else. They might be talking about you, without ever needing to say your name. Heuristic triggering. Have you ever made a snap decision that felt completely right in the moment, only to realize later that you didn't really think it through? Maybe you picked the more expensive brand because it had better packaging. Or you trusted someone immediately just because they looked confident. These aren't just quirks of human behavior. They're examples of something much deeper going on in the mind, a process called heuristic triggering. Heuristics are mental shortcuts. They are quick automatic rules our brains use to make decisions faster and with less effort. They're not necessarily bad. In fact, they help us get through the day without overloading ourselves with constant analysis. Imagine having to weigh every single option in the cereal aisle, or evaluate the pros and cons of every email before replying. Life would grind to a halt. Heuristics keep things moving. But when those shortcuts are triggered deliberately or unconsciously, and when we rely on them in situations that deserve more careful thought, they can become dangerous, misleading, or manipulative. Heuristic triggering happens when a cue, often visual, verbal, or emotional, activates one of these mental shortcuts. The brain receives a signal, skips detailed reasoning, and jumps straight to a decision. It feels intuitive, even obvious, but it's not always accurate. And what's fascinating is that we often don't notice it's happening. Think about the authority heuristic. When someone wears a lab coat or speaks confidently, we're more likely to believe them, even if we don't actually know their credentials. The cue of authority triggers trust. Or consider the scarcity heuristic. When you see only 2 left in stock or limited time offer, your brain doesn't stop to evaluate whether the item is truly valuable. It skips ahead to urgency and desire. The trigger isn't logic, it's fear of missing out. There's also the representativeness heuristic, where we judge someone or something based on how well it fits a mental stereotype. If someone looks the part, sounds the part, or fits our internal template, we assume things about them, often without any real information. This can lead to errors in judgment, trusting the wrong person, rejecting the right one, or making unfair assumptions. Marketers, politicians, salespeople, and even content creators use these triggers all the time. Sometimes subtly, sometimes aggressively. A commercial with soothing music and smiling families activates emotional safety. A product with sleek design and minimalist packaging might trigger a premium equals quality shortcut. Even certain words like expert, proven, or guaranteed are engineered to press our heuristic buttons. But it's not just manipulation from the outside. We trigger our own heuristics too. When we're tired, stressed, or under pressure, we lean on shortcuts even more. Our brains conserve energy by defaulting to the familiar, the immediate, or the emotionally satisfying. This is why important decisions made under stress can feel right in the moment, yet fall apart under reflection. The decision wasn't based on full understanding. It was based on a triggered shortcut. What makes heuristic triggering so interesting and so powerful is that it works beneath awareness. We don't always realize we've used a shortcut. We just feel confident in the choice we've made. That's what makes it so hard to catch. These are not big, flashing signs saying you are being influenced. They're gentle nudges. Slight cues, a word, a tone, a look, and in a split second, our brains take the bait. This doesn't mean heuristics are bad. On the contrary, they're essential. Without them, we'd be frozen by indecision. The key is awareness. When we know how heuristics work, we can start to notice when we're relying on them, and whether it's appropriate. For example, trusting a friendly stranger with directions is probably fine. Trusting them with your bank account? That might deserve a second thought. One of the best ways to defend against unwanted heuristic triggering is to slow down. Just pausing for a moment before making a decision gives the analytical part of the brain a chance to catch up. Ask yourself, am I choosing this because it makes sense or because it feels right? That single question can snap you out of an automatic response and into conscious decision-making. It's also helpful to notice patterns in language or presentation. Words like must have, hurry, or experts agree are often designed to trigger shortcuts. When you hear them, treat them as red flags, not necessarily signs of deception, but indicators that you should pay closer attention. And this goes both ways. You can use heuristic triggering in ethical, intentional ways. Teachers, for example, might use clear visual cues to help students remember complex topics. Coaches use repetition and positive framing to help athletes trust their instincts. Even self-improvement relies on triggering mental shortcuts, using small habits, visual reminders, or motivational phrases to guide behavior without constant mental effort. Like many psychological tactics, heuristic triggering is neither good nor bad by itself. It's a tool. Its ethical value comes down to how and why it's used. Is the goal to manipulate someone into a choice that benefits only the persuader? Or is it to guide someone toward a decision that aligns with their own values and goals? That distinction makes all the difference. Heuristic triggering reveals just how much of our behavior is automatic, and how little conscious control we often have over what feels like deliberate choice. But with awareness, that changes. By learning to spot the triggers, whether in ads, in conversations, or in ourselves, we move from being passive reactors to active thinkers. We slow down, we reflect, we reclaim our decisions. So next time you find yourself reaching for something, agreeing with someone, or jumping to a conclusion just a little too quickly, pause. Ask yourself where that decision is really coming from. And you might discover that the voice in your head wasn't actually yours to begin with. It was a shortcut, triggered and automatic. Now you get to take the wheel. Strategic vagueness. Have you ever listened to someone speak, a politician, a marketer, maybe even a manager, and walked away thinking, they said a lot, but I'm not exactly sure what they said? You might remember the tone, the confidence, even the emotional impression they left. But when you try to recall specific details, the message slips through your fingers like fog. That's not a coincidence. You may have just encountered a tactic called strategic vagueness. Strategic vagueness is the deliberate use of ambiguity to influence, persuade, or protect the speaker from being pinned down. It's when someone chooses to be unclear on purpose, not because they lack information, but because clarity comes with consequences. By staying vague, they avoid committing to specific facts, promises, or positions, while still creating the illusion that something meaningful was said. This tactic appears everywhere. In corporate statements, political speeches, advertising, and everyday conversations. It's in phrases like, "We're working hard to improve outcomes," or "exciting changes are coming soon." These lines sound positive, even inspiring. But what exactly is being improved? What's actually changing? The details are missing, and that's the point. The listener fills in the blanks with what they want or expect to hear, which makes the vague message feel personally satisfying, even if it's empty on inspection. Strategic vagueness is not the same as poor communication. In fact, it's often executed with great skill. It uses language that feels specific, even when it's not. It relies on emotionally charged words, suggestive phrasing, and confident delivery. The message is carefully designed to imply a lot, while revealing very little. It's not lying, it's not saying. Politicians often use this technique when trying to appeal to broad audiences with conflicting values. Instead of taking a firm stance, they might say, "We believe in a better future for everyone," or "We're going to restore balance to the system." It sounds visionary, it sounds bold, but it's so nonspecific that nearly any voter can interpret it in a way that supports their beliefs. The statement becomes a kind of mirror, reflecting the hopes of whoever is listening. In advertising, strategic vagueness plays a different role. It's used to create intrigue or aspiration without overpromising. Think about taglines like, "Because you're worth it," or "Experience the difference." What exactly is the difference? What does worth it mean? The language invites the consumer to project their desires onto the product. Vague claims create emotional engagement without the liability of specifics. Even in relationships and everyday communication, we use strategic vagueness. When someone says, "Let's talk later," or "We'll see how it goes," it often buys time or avoids confrontation. It keeps the conversation open-ended, non-committal, and safe. Sometimes that's necessary. Not every situation calls for hard lines or firm decisions. But when vagueness becomes a habit or a tactic to dodge accountability, it begins to erode trust. What makes strategic vagueness so effective is that it hands the power of interpretation to the listener. Instead of clearly defining what's being offered or intended, it allows the audience to draw their own conclusions, usually favorable ones. We tend to fill in gaps with optimism. When someone says, "Big things are coming," we imagine what we hope those things will be. And because the speaker never defined them, they can later shift the narrative without technically being dishonest. In business, this can be a protective move. Leaders might use vague language when discussing uncertain plans, legal matters, or upcoming changes. Saying, "We're exploring a range of options to serve our customers better," sounds reassuring without revealing anything concrete. It maintains flexibility while preserving morale. But if used too often, this kind of language can also frustrate teams, customers, or investors who are looking for transparency. Strategic vagueness becomes dangerous when it's used to manipulate expectations or avoid accountability. If someone routinely avoids specifics to escape criticism or responsibility, they create a smokescreen. Over time, that erodes credibility. Clarity becomes rare, and decisions feel like they're made in the shadows. People begin to sense they're being handled, not informed. Yet when used ethically and sparingly, vagueness can serve legitimate purposes. It can soften harsh realities, maintain discretion in sensitive situations, or keep communication open when certainty isn't possible. Not every decision is ready to be made public. Not every truth needs to be delivered bluntly. In those moments, strategic vagueness can be a tool of diplomacy rather than deception. The key difference lies in intention. Are you being vague because you're protecting people from unnecessary stress, or because you're avoiding hard truths? Are you softening a message to buy time for thoughtful planning, or are you stalling to maintain control? The line between caution and manipulation is often thin, but it matters deeply. To become more resistant to strategic vagueness, listeners can train themselves to pause and ask, what does that actually mean? When someone says, "This will be great for everyone," we can follow up with, "In what way? How will we measure success? Who specifically benefits?" Clarity should be a right, not a reward, for asking the right questions. When we challenge vague language, kindly but firmly, we help create a culture of accountability. And if we find ourselves using vague language too often, it might be worth asking, what are we avoiding? Sometimes the path to trust isn't through sounding polished, but through being honest, even if that means admitting uncertainty. Strategic vagueness is subtle, powerful, and easy to miss. It doesn't shout, it suggests. It doesn't lie, it leads you to believe. And when used carefully, it can maintain harmony and flexibility. But when relied on too heavily, it becomes a mask that hides the truth behind pretty words. In a world that craves authenticity, there's nothing more radical or more refreshing than clarity. Faux vulnerability. Have you ever heard someone open up about a personal struggle, only to feel like something was off? Maybe their words were emotional, but their timing felt too perfect. Maybe it seemed rehearsed, like a confession designed more to impress than to connect. Or maybe they shared something that sounded vulnerable, but somehow made them look good in the process. That's not real openness, that's a tactic. And it has a name: faux vulnerability. Faux vulnerability is the appearance of being emotionally open, used strategically to gain trust, admiration, or sympathy, without the actual risk or authenticity that true vulnerability requires. It mimics the format of honesty. A personal anecdote, a lowered voice, a moment of seeming transparency. But at its core, it's calculated. It's designed to manipulate people to see the speaker rather than to genuinely connect. True vulnerability is raw. It's uncertain. It's uncomfortable. When someone is genuinely vulnerable, they're putting something at stake. They're risking judgment or rejection. There's a sense of emotional exposure. Faux vulnerability, on the other hand, is emotionally safe. It's curated, polished, and often self-serving. It reveals just enough to seem sincere, but not enough to ever truly cost the speaker anything. You'll often see this tactic used in leadership, personal branding, or influencer culture. A CEO shares a humbling moment from their past, but it conveniently ends with their success. A content creator tells a story about struggling with confidence, but only in a way that reinforces their image as strong and inspiring. They might say, "I used to feel like I wasn't enough, but then I realized I was powerful all along." There's a punchline, a brandable moral. It's less about their pain and more about their personal triumph. And importantly, it keeps them in control of the narrative. The reason faux vulnerability works so well is because real vulnerability is magnetic. As humans, we're drawn to authenticity. We're wired to respond with empathy when someone opens up. We lean in when people share something intimate. So when someone appears to drop their guard, our instinct is to trust them more. That trust becomes social currency, whether it's in personal relationships, professional spaces, or public platforms. And some people, consciously or not, learn to exploit that. The key difference between vulnerability and faux vulnerability is intent. Vulnerability is about connection. It says, "Here's something real about me," even if it's uncomfortable. It asks nothing from the other person except presence. Faux vulnerability, however, is about leverage. It says, "Here's a curated struggle that makes me look relatable, admirable, or brave." And usually there's something being gained: sympathy, validation, attention, or influence. This tactic becomes especially toxic in leadership or mentorship roles. When a figure of authority pretends to be vulnerable to appear approachable, but avoids any real accountability, they're not building trust, they're faking intimacy. For example, a boss might say, "I've struggled too," as a way to deflect from criticism or avoid responsibility. But they never actually admit fault or show real emotional risk. It's a shield wrapped in sentiment. In romantic relationships or friendships, faux vulnerability can be even more deceptive. A person might share stories of trauma or difficulty early on, creating the illusion of deep emotional connection. But over time, you may notice a pattern. The vulnerability doesn't deepen, it doesn't evolve, and when you try to open up in return, they stay guarded. Or worse, they use your honesty against you. Their vulnerability was a strategy to get close quickly, not an invitation to mutual trust. Social media has amplified this behavior. Platforms reward emotional content. Stories of struggle perform well. Posts about burnout, anxiety, insecurity, when packaged just right, generate likes, shares, and followers. But sometimes the person sharing isn't actually looking for connection or support. They're looking for growth. Not personal growth, follower growth. The line between authentic expression and emotional performance blurs, and audiences are left wondering what's real. To be clear, not everyone sharing personal stories is being manipulative. Vulnerability looks different for everyone. And sometimes we practice being open before we feel fully comfortable. There's nothing wrong with telling a story that ends in strength. What matters is whether the sharing is honest or optimized. Whether it's messy and human or slick and rehearsed. Whether it invites others into connection or puts the spotlight back on the speaker. So how can you tell the difference? Pay attention to risk. Is the speaker revealing something that might actually change how they're perceived? Or are they only sharing safe, socially approved struggles? Notice the pattern. Do they always share vulnerability with a brand-friendly twist? Or are they sometimes unsure, imperfect, and unresolved? And consider the outcome. Are they opening up to build connection or to build an image? Faux vulnerability. The most trustworthy people are often the ones who don't always have a tidy takeaway. They're the ones who say, "I don't know how to fix this," or "I'm still working through it." Real vulnerability is not a performance. It's a presence. It doesn't always seek applause. Sometimes it just seeks to be seen. Faux vulnerability is tempting. It's powerful. And when used cynically, it can be deeply manipulative. But in a culture that's beginning to value emotional honesty more than ever, it's also becoming easier to spot. When everything feels too neat, too polished, too on brand, it probably is. So the next time you hear someone open up, pause for a moment, look past the tone. Ask yourself, what are they really sharing, and what are they trying to gain? Because sometimes the most convincing mask is the one that looks the most sincere. Authority echoing. Have you ever noticed how quickly people start to agree when someone with authority speaks? Or how an idea that might have been questioned just moments ago suddenly becomes accepted once it's repeated by the right person? That's not a coincidence. That's a phenomenon known as authority echoing. a subtle but powerful psychological tactic that leverages influence, conformity, and social validation to shape opinions. Authority echoing is when people repeat, agree with, or amplify the statements of someone perceived to be in power or possess expertise, not necessarily because the message is true, but because of who said it. It's the echo that follows a statement, not because of critical thinking, but because the room just got quieter and everyone looked toward the person in charge. The idea, once stated by an authority figure, becomes reinforced, not through evidence, but through repetition and agreement, often unconscious. It starts with a simple psychological truth: we're wired to defer to authority. From an evolutionary perspective, humans survived by following leaders who kept the tribe safe. That instinct is still deeply embedded in us. When someone appears confident, experienced, or powerful, we're more likely to believe them, even if we don't fully understand the topic. Authority becomes a shortcut, a heuristic for truth. And once a claim comes from an authority, others start repeating it to align with that perceived correctness. But here's where the echo begins. Once the initial authoritative voice speaks, others often follow, not because they've carefully considered the statement, but because they want to be on the right side of the conversation. In meetings, boardrooms, classrooms, or online forums, this dynamic is everywhere. A senior executive makes a vague suggestion, and suddenly colleagues begin affirming the idea, adding comments that subtly echo the tone or message. The original point gets louder, not because it's been critically examined, but because no one wants to contradict someone in power. This isn't always malicious. Sometimes, people echo authority out of respect or a desire to show support. Other times, it's a survival tactic, especially in hierarchical environments where challenging authority might carry real social or professional risks. People learn quickly. It feels safer to agree than to object. And when multiple people begin repeating or paraphrasing what the authority said, the idea gains artificial momentum. It starts to sound like consensus. And once something sounds like consensus, it becomes even harder to question. That's the echo chamber effect. Authority echoing creates a feedback loop. The original statement is repeated, it gains volume, and that volume becomes mistaken for validity. Dissent fades into the background, not because it's wrong, but because it's outnumbered. And in a group setting, silence often gets interpreted as agreement. So the echo grows louder. This tactic is particularly common in political messaging, branding, media, and organizational leadership. A politician makes a claim, and suddenly supporters, pundits, and spokespeople are all repeating the same language, sometimes verbatim. It's not just persuasive because it's loud. It's persuasive because it gives the illusion that everyone agrees. And that kind of social pressure is hard to resist. People start to adopt opinions not because they believe in them deeply, but because it feels like the dominant view. In corporate culture, authority echoing can be even more subtle. A CEO introduces a vague vision like, "We're becoming more agile," and soon every manager is echoing that language in presentations, emails, and performance reviews. The idea may never be clearly defined, but it becomes institutionalized through repetition. People begin to act on it, not because they fully understand it, but because it seems like that's what's expected. And in online spaces, the effect is amplified. Influencers, public figures, or self-proclaimed experts make sweeping statements, and followers quickly repost, reshare, or quote those ideas, sometimes without checking for accuracy. The authority might be manufactured, but the echo is real. And the louder it gets, the more legitimate it feels. So what's the risk? Authority echoing undermines independent thinking. It creates environments where ideas are accepted not on their merit, but on their origin. It silences minority viewpoints. It discourages critical questioning. And worst of all, it can lead to decisions being made without true debate or understanding, just collective agreement based on a single voice at the top. But recognizing this pattern is the first step to breaking it. When you hear an idea repeated often, ask yourself, where did this come from? Am I agreeing because I believe it, or because I trust who said it? Do I actually understand it? And more importantly, do I feel safe disagreeing? If you're in a position of power, it's even more important to watch for this. Authority figures can unintentionally create echo chambers by speaking too early, too strongly, or too often. Teams begin echoing their words without real engagement. To avoid this, ask others to speak first. Create room for dissent. Reward questions, not just agreement. Because true leadership isn't about being echoed, it's about being challenged thoughtfully and welcoming it. Authority. Echoing is subtle. It feels like agreement, but sometimes it's just deference in disguise. It sounds like consensus, but it may just be repetition. The more we become aware of this pattern, the more we can pause before we join the echo. And in that pause, there's room for truth, not just volume. Endowment effect. Have you ever tried to sell something you own? An old phone, a worn jacket, maybe a car, and found yourself thinking it was worth far more than what anyone else seemed willing to pay? It might not just be sentimentality. What you're experiencing is something psychologists call the endowment effect. It's a powerful cognitive bias that leads us to place a higher value on things we own simply because they are ours. The concept was first formally studied by behavioral economist Richard Taylor in 1980. Thaler noticed that people often demanded much more money to give up an item than they were willing to pay to acquire it in the first place. In one of the most cited demonstrations, researchers Daniel Kahneman, Jack Netsch, and Thaler gave participants mugs as a gift. Then they asked some of the participants to sell the mug and others to buy one. Sellers typically demanded twice as much as buyers were willing to pay. Why? The mug hadn't changed. Its objective market value was the same. But once people owned it, even for just a few minutes, they started valuing it more. That's the endowment effect in action. At its core, the endowment effect shows that our brains don't treat ownership rationally. We form attachments quickly, and once we see something as ours, we become biased. That attachment isn't just emotional, it actually changes our perception of value. It's as if ownership casts a kind of psychological glow over an item, inflating its worth in our minds. You don't need a fancy economics experiment to see this in everyday life. Think about garage sales. People often price items with an inflated sense of worth, baffled when others aren't eager to pay. Or look at people listing things online, used gadgets, clothes, furniture. The asking price often doesn't match the actual market value, because the seller has subconsciously assigned more value to the object simply because they owned it. This bias doesn't stop at physical items. It applies to ideas, decisions, and even relationships. Once we commit to something, whether it's a business plan, a belief system, or a political stance, we begin to value it more simply because we chose it. This can lead to irrational clinging, defending flawed decisions because we made them, overvaluing our role in a project, or refusing to let go of ideas that no longer serve us. Marketers and salespeople know how to exploit the endowment effect. Ever notice how you're encouraged to try before you buy? Free trials, test drives, or even the act of holding a product in a store can create a brief sense of ownership. And once that's established, you're more likely to buy. Even online, e-commerce sites offer free returns, not just as a convenience, but as a psychological tactic. If you receive something and hold on to it for a few days, you're far less likely to send it back, even if you weren't excited about it in the first place. That's the endowment effect, creating a kind of mental inertia. Real estate offers another striking example. Homeowners routinely overestimate the value of their homes when selling. The home holds memories, milestones, maybe even a sense of identity. But buyers see none of that. They just see walls, square footage, and location. And the seller's frustration often stems from this psychological mismatch, an invisible gap between subjective value and objective reality. Interestingly, the endowment effect is stronger when we feel a sense of responsibility or pride in the item or decision. If we built it, chose it, invested time in it, we value it even more. That's why creators, artists, and entrepreneurs often struggle to price their work fairly or accept criticism. It feels personal. Their ownership isn't just legal or physical, it's deeply emotional. So what's the harm in this bias? It can cloud judgment. It can lead us to hold on to unproductive investments, financial or emotional. It can prevent innovation when we cling to old ways of thinking. It makes negotiation harder and decision-making less rational. When we overvalue what we already have, we become less open to change, less willing to trade or adapt, and more prone to disappointment when others don't share our perception. But awareness of the endowment effect gives us power. When we recognize it, we can pause and question our assumptions. Am I valuing this object or this belief because it's truly worth it, or just because it's mine? We can also use this knowledge to our advantage. When you're trying to persuade someone, helping them feel ownership through choice, involvement, or personalization can increase buy-in and cooperation. Psychology teaches us that the mind doesn't always operate rationally. The endowment effect is a reminder that our sense of value is not objective. It's shaped by our attachments. That coffee mug on your desk, the clutter in your garage, even that old opinion you've held on to for years, none of it is immune. Ownership changes how we see the world. But by noticing that shift, we can make clearer decisions, let go more gracefully, and see value with more clarity, not just sentiment. Have you ever been watching a commercial or shopping online, and just as you're considering the offer, the host or website adds, "But wait, that's not all"? Suddenly, you're getting more than you expected. An extra item, a discount, maybe free shipping, and the deal feels irresistible. That isn't just clever marketing copy. It's a carefully studied persuasion strategy known as the "that's not all" technique. This psychological tactic is simple in structure but surprisingly powerful. It works by presenting an initial offer, then sweetening the deal before the person has a chance to accept or reject it. The twist is in the timing. The bonus or improved offer is introduced as though it's spontaneous, a favor or an exclusive opportunity, making the recipient feel like they're getting something special. The term "that's not all" was coined by psychologist Jerry M. Berger in the 1980s, who explored how changes in offer presentation affected people's willingness to comply. In a classic study, Berger set up a stand selling cupcakes. In one version, the price was listed as 75 cents from the start. In another version, the seller would say the cupcakes were $1, but then, before the customer could respond, they'd say, "Wait, actually, they're only 75 cents. The outcome? People were significantly more likely to buy when the price was reduced as a surprise. Why? Because of something deeply rooted in human psychology. The feeling of receiving a concession triggers a sense of obligation. It's related to the reciprocity principle. We feel compelled to give something back when we perceive that someone has done something generous or accommodating for us. Even if it's a stranger adjusting the price of a cupcake, our brain treats it as a personal favor, and we feel a subtle pressure to respond by accepting the offer. This technique also plays on perceived value, by starting with a more modest offer and then adding more to it. Whether it's a bonus product, a reduced price, or an exclusive perk, the offer feels richer, more generous, and more limited. Our brain interprets it as, "I'm getting more than I would have before," which creates a sense of urgency and excitement. It's not just a transaction anymore, it's a deal. Infomercials are famous for this. "You'll get one, but that's not all. We'll send you two and throw in the bonus accessories. Just pay shipping and handling." These offers aren't necessarily better than what you'd find elsewhere, but the presentation triggers emotions that short-circuit rational analysis. It feels like a win. Interestingly, the "that's not all" technique works even when the improvement in the offer was always intended. That is, the seller never truly intended to give the less generous deal, but the illusion of getting a bonus still activates the same psychological response. The trick lies in how it's framed, not in the actual value. This tactic isn't confined to marketing. It shows up in personal interactions too. Imagine someone asking for help moving. They might say, "Can you help me move on Saturday?" Then, before you respond, they add, "And I'll buy you lunch, and bring beer." This makes it harder to say no. Not because the lunch and beer are irresistible, but because it feels like they're offering more to make it easier for you. You feel seen, acknowledged, and that makes a difference. Teachers, leaders, even negotiators use this intuitively. A parent asking a child to clean their room might add, "And if you do it before dinner, you can have an extra hour of screen time." The initial request stays the same, but the sweetened deal makes it more palatable. In sales, it might look like a company offering exclusive bonuses for signing up today, even if those bonuses are standard for everyone. The presentation makes it feel like a favor, and favors are hard to refuse. There's also a social element involved. When someone makes an offer that seems customized or added on just for you, it implies attention and care. That's another reason this technique works so well. It gives the impression of a human connection, even if it's a scripted sales pitch. And that impression alone can increase compliance. Of course, like all psychological techniques, the "that's not all" approach can be used ethically or manipulatively. When used transparently, it can genuinely help people feel more satisfied and appreciated. It can enhance perceived fairness and encourage cooperation. But when it's used to disguise a mediocre product or push people into decisions they'd otherwise avoid, it crosses into manipulation. The key lies in intent. If you're aware of the technique, you can begin to recognize it in the wild. You'll start spotting those last-minute extras in ads, emails, and conversations. And when you do, take a moment to pause and reflect. Is the offer really better, or is it just presented that way? Is your enthusiasm coming from the product, or from the feeling that someone just did you a favor? Understanding that "that's not all" technique helps you become a more informed consumer, a sharper negotiator, and a more mindful communicator. It reminds us that how something is offered can be just as influential as what's being offered. And it gives you a moment of clarity in a world filled with psychological nudges. Flooding. Imagine this. You're feeling anxious or scared about something, maybe speaking in front of a crowd or going to the dentist. Now imagine being suddenly overwhelmed by all the stimuli related to that fear from every angle, all at once. The noise, the pressure, the sensations, all bombarding you at the same time. This is what psychologists call flooding. Flooding is a form of exposure therapy, but it's not your typical gradual approach to confronting fears. Rather than starting small and building up to the feared stimulus over time, flooding throws you straight into the deep end. It's an intense, immersive experience that forces you to face your phobia head-on, often in a way that feels overwhelming. While it might sound extreme, it's designed to break the cycle of avoidance and help the individual confront their fear in an all-encompassing way. Over time, this intense exposure is meant to help the brain rewire itself and reduce the fear response. This technique is based on a concept called classical conditioning, the same principle made famous by Ivan Pavlov in the early 20th century. In simple terms, classical conditioning happens when a neutral stimulus gets linked with a response. Over time, the stimulus, like a bell, can trigger the same response, like salivating, even when no food is involved. In the case of flooding, the idea is to recondition your brain to the fear trigger. By exposing someone to their fear in a controlled, all-encompassing manner, the brain learns to associate the situation with calm, rather than panic. One of the most famous studies demonstrating the principle of flooding was conducted by Joseph Wolpe in the 1960s. Wolpe, a South African psychiatrist, was one of the early pioneers of behavior therapy and had a particular interest in how phobias could be treated. In his work, Wolpe used flooding to treat people with severe animal phobias. In one case, a person with a fear of rabbits was placed in a room with the animal and forced to stay there for an extended period. Over time, the subject's anxiety began to decrease as they realized the feared animal posed no immediate threat. In fact, flooding works by overriding the body's fight-or-flight response. When someone is exposed to a phobia in an overwhelming way, the body's initial surge of adrenaline and stress starts to dissipate over time because no real harm occurs. As the stress response fades, the brain starts to recognize that the stimulus, the rabbit, the heights, the dentist's chair, doesn't actually trigger danger. Instead, it's just a neutral event. This process, known as habituation, is a key component of how flooding works. Over time, repeated exposure can make the individual less sensitive to the fear trigger. But here's the twist. Flooding is not for everyone. While it can be effective in certain situations, it's incredibly intense and can be emotionally taxing. Imagine someone terrified of public speaking being thrown into a packed auditorium with no prior preparation. For some, this type of exposure can be so overwhelming that it could lead to a more entrenched fear rather than relief. The shock value of the experience might reinforce the anxiety rather than reduce it. That's why flooding is typically used in controlled environments and under the supervision of trained therapists. It's not a technique that should be self-administered or used haphazardly. Research has shown that flooding can be effective for specific types of phobias, especially when it comes to simple, specific fears. For example, people who have a fear of flying, spiders, or heights can experience significant reductions in their anxiety levels after undergoing a flooding treatment. The reason these fears are more suited for flooding is that they are usually tied to a very specific stimulus. The person is anxious only about flying or encountering a spider, not the broad, abstract anxiety that might arise from more complex fears. However, flooding is not universally effective. In fact, it's generally less successful when it comes to more generalized anxiety or psychological issues like social anxiety or PTSD. In cases like these, gradual exposure therapy, where the person is exposed to the fear in smaller, manageable doses, is usually a better choice. Gradual exposure allows the person to feel more in control of the process and less likely to become overwhelmed. Now let's take a step back and look at how flooding manifests outside the clinical setting. Flooding isn't just a therapeutic strategy. It's also a powerful tool in the world of marketing and media. Ever watched a commercial with flashing images, music, and intense sales pitches all happening at once? That's a form of flooding designed to trigger an emotional response. It's also why you might feel an urge to buy something immediately, even if you've never thought about it before. The experience is overwhelming enough that you feel pressured to act. Take, for instance, the classic Black Friday shopping event. The constant bombardment of discounts, limited-time offers, and hyped-up ads create an environment where people feel pressured to buy. The overwhelming nature of the event, both the physical environment of crowded stores and the emotional pressure of fleeting offers, triggers people to act impulsively. This is another example of how flooding works outside the therapy room, this time manipulating the brain's instinctive response to urgency and scarcity. Interestingly, flooding isn't always negative. It can also be used for positive psychological conditioning. In certain situations, like public speaking or taking on a big challenge, experiencing a flood of anxiety might eventually lead to personal growth. Overcoming this overwhelming experience can lead to greater self-confidence and resilience. The discomfort that comes with the flood of anxiety is short-lived, and once you've endured it, you may find it easier to face similar challenges in the future. In conclusion, flooding is a technique that taps into the way our brains deal with fear and anxiety. By exposing ourselves to our worst fears in a controlled, intense way, we can teach our brains to recognize that these fears are not as dangerous as they may seem. But just like any psychological tool, flooding requires careful use. It's not a one-size-fits-all solution, and when used improperly, it can backfire. Whether in therapy or in marketing, flooding plays on the intense emotional responses we experience in the face of overwhelming stimuli. So next time you're feeling overwhelmed, ask yourself, is this a true danger, or am I just being flooded? The Pique Technique. Have you ever found yourself walking down the street and someone approaches you with a seemingly unusual request? Something that, at first, feels out of place? Maybe they ask, "Excuse me, can you spare 37 cents?" instead of the typical, "Can you spare some change?" You'd probably stop and think, why 37 cents? This specific, almost strange request grabs your attention in a way that a more generic plea might not. This is an example of the Pique Technique, a psychological tactic that uses unusual or unexpected elements to break the automatic thinking process and make you pay attention. The Pique Technique is a form of persuasion that leverages the power of surprise or novelty to disrupt our usual cognitive patterns. It's based on a simple principle. When something stands out from the norm, it catches our attention. And when our attention is piqued, we're more likely to engage with the request being made, whether we realize it or not. The term Pique Technique was coined in the early 1990s by psychologists David J. Cialdini, Robert B. Cialdini, and Noah Goldstein. They were studying ways to increase compliance with requests, and one of their key discoveries was that when people make an unusual or unexpected request, it can bypass your automatic defenses against requests. It works because it feels out of place and grabs your curiosity, which leads you to stop and think about the request, even if it's not something you'd usually consider. Consider this scenario. You're walking down the street when someone asks you for a small donation to help feed hungry children. Your immediate response is probably to keep walking, because you've heard this plea 1,000 times before. It doesn't surprise you. But if the same person were to ask, "Excuse me, can you spare 17 cents to help feed hungry children?" you'd likely stop. Why 17 cents? It's a specific number that piques your curiosity, and you suddenly find yourself thinking about whether you could spare that very small amount. This technique relies on disrupting your habitual thought process. The brain is constantly looking for patterns and shortcuts, so when something deviates from the norm, it forces you to pay attention. And in that moment of curiosity, the requester has a brief window to make their case, whether it's asking for a favor, a donation, or even making a sales pitch. The specificity of the request makes it feel personal and different, which leads to a more engaged response. Now, you might be wondering, why does this work? The Pique Technique taps into something called the automatic thinking that we all use to navigate daily life. Most of the time, we don't stop to question every single interaction we have. Our brains are constantly filtering out information that feels routine, familiar, or insignificant. When something seems unexpected, however, it disrupts this automatic filter. The unexpectedness of the request makes it stand out, which momentarily overrides our normal resistance to requests. This process is a natural result of how our brains are wired to deal with information overload. The Pique technique can be applied in a variety of settings. In a marketing context, companies often use unusual or unexpected advertising tactics to grab attention. Think of those outlandish infomercials that feature absurd products or wild claims. The more unconventional the offer, the more likely it is to grab attention, at least momentarily. For example, consider a commercial for a kitchen gadget that promises to cut your food prep time by 50%, but it's done in a way that's deliberately quirky and eye-catching. The oddity of the message makes you stop and pay attention, even if you don't end up buying the product. Beyond marketing, the Pique technique is also used in sales and persuasion. A salesperson who asks you, "Would you like to buy this product for $23.79? might be less effective than one who asks, "Would you like to buy this product for $23.79 today or $26.99 later?" The unexpected nature of the question, with its unusual comparison of prices, grabs your attention. It causes you to think about the decision for a moment longer than you normally would, and that extra bit of reflection might lead you to make the purchase. The Pique technique also plays a role in social influence. If you want to convince someone to do something for you, say, ask a friend to help you move, introducing an unexpected element can increase your chances of success. Instead of just saying, "Hey, can you help me move this weekend?" you could say, "Hey, can you help me move this weekend? I'll buy you pizza and drinks afterward." The unexpected incentive catches their attention, and now they're not just thinking about the inconvenience of moving. They're thinking about the bonus of free food and drinks. Research on the Pique technique has shown its effectiveness in a wide range of scenarios. In one classic study by Cialdini and colleagues in the 1990s, they had experimenters approach people with the request for spare change when the request was generic, like, "Do you have any change?" It was less successful. However, when the request was phrased unusually, like, "Do you have 17 cents?" compliance rates increased dramatically. The specificity and oddity of the request made people pause, think, and respond. In another experiment, researchers tested the Pique technique in the context of charity donation requests. When people were asked for a specific and unusual amount of money, like $1.83, they were more likely to donate than when the request was a generic plea for $1. The specificity made the request seem more genuine and gave it a sense of uniqueness, making people more likely to comply. So what can we learn from this? The Pique technique shows us the power of unexpectedness and novelty in persuasion. By breaking the pattern and asking for something unusual, you can bypass the brain's usual resistance to requests and make your message stand out. It's a small adjustment, but it has the potential to make a big impact. Whether you're trying to get someone to buy something, donate to a cause, or simply say yes to your request. The next time you're faced with a decision or a request, take a moment to reflect. Is there anything about this request that stands out? Is it using a little bit of unexpectedness to grab your attention? Understanding the Pique Technique can help you become more aware of how you're being influenced and how you can influence others in subtle yet powerful ways. The framing effect. Have you ever been in a situation where the exact same information was presented to you in two different ways, but your decision was completely different depending on how it was framed? For example, imagine you're buying a product and you're told it's 95% fat-free versus being told it's 5% fat. Despite both phrases meaning the same thing, they can make you feel differently about the product. This is the framing effect in action. A psychological phenomenon that shows how the way information is presented can significantly influence our choices and judgments. At its core, the framing effect suggests that our decisions are not just based on the facts themselves, but also on how those facts are framed or worded. In other words, how information is presented, whether positively or negatively, can alter how we perceive and evaluate it, even if the underlying facts are identical. The framing effect was first introduced by psychologists Amos Tversky and Daniel Kahneman in 1981. They conducted a groundbreaking study that demonstrated how the framing of choices could lead people to make dramatically different decisions, even when the actual outcomes were the same. In this study, participants were presented with two different scenarios about an outbreak of a deadly disease. One scenario framed the decision in terms of lives saved, while the other framed it in terms of lives lost. Despite the two options being mathematically equivalent, people were far more likely to choose a solution that framed the situation in a positive light, focusing on the lives saved. To put it in perspective, imagine this situation. You are given two options for dealing with the outbreak. Option A, save 200 lives. Option B, there's a 33% chance that 600 people will be saved, and a 67% chance that nobody will be saved. Both options present the same statistical outcome. 200 people will be saved, but option B introduces an element of risk that makes it seem less appealing. However, when framed differently, option C, 200 people will die. Option D, there's a 33% chance that nobody will die, and a 67% chance that 600 will die. This time, people are more likely to choose option D, even though it's statistically identical to the other two. The way the options are framed, the emphasis on the losses versus the gains, makes a huge difference in how people react. The core principle behind the framing effect is that people tend to avoid losses more than they seek gains. This behavior is known as loss aversion, a concept also popularized by Kahneman and Tversky. When choices are framed in terms of potential loss, people feel a stronger emotional reaction and are more likely to take the safe option, even if it's not the most rational one. On the other hand, when choices are framed in terms of potential gain, people are more willing to take risks. The impact of framing can be seen in marketing and advertising all the time. Companies are masters of the framing effect, skillfully crafting their messages to influence consumer decisions. Think of how many times you've seen the phrase "buy one, get one free" versus 50% off. Though both deals offer the same financial benefit, the buy one, get one free frame feels like a much better deal. Why? Because the free aspect of the deal frames the transaction as a gain, making it seem more valuable than simply receiving a discount. Another example comes from health communication. When trying to encourage people to get vaccinated, framing can play a significant role in their decision. If the message is framed in terms of the benefits, like getting vaccinated helps protect you and others from serious illness, people are more likely to comply. However, if the message is framed in terms of loss, like if you don't get vaccinated, you risk getting sick or spreading the disease, people may feel the need to act out of fear of loss, which can still be effective. The framing of the message can alter the emotional response to it, making it seem more or less threatening and influencing the outcome. Another fascinating example of the framing effect comes from politics. During election campaigns, candidates often frame their positions and policies in terms of either the positive outcomes they will create or the negative consequences of their opponent's policies. A candidate might say, "My policy will create thousands of jobs," gain framing, or my opponent's policy will cost jobs, loss framing. Both statements are about job creation or loss, but the emotional impact of the framing can lead people to feel more positively or negatively toward a particular candidate, even when the facts behind the statements are similar. Framing also has significant effects on our health decisions. For instance, researchers have found that people are more likely to undergo surgery when the surgeon emphasizes the survival rate, a positive frame, versus the mortality rate, a negative frame, even if both statistics are derived from the same data. The positive framing of survival makes the decision to undergo surgery feel less risky and more hopeful, while the negative framing of mortality emphasizes potential loss, causing more hesitation and fear. Interestingly, framing can be applied in legal settings as well. In criminal trials, the way a lawyer frames their argument can influence the jury's perception. If a defense lawyer emphasizes the defendant's good character or past accomplishments, it can frame the defendant in a more positive light, leading to more lenient judgment. Conversely, framing the defendant as someone who made a mistake or committed an impulsive crime could lead to harsher consequences. While the framing effect demonstrates how subjective and malleable our decision-making processes can be, it's important to note that we are not always aware of how much framing influences us. In fact, many of our decisions are shaped by the subtle ways information is presented to us, without us ever consciously realizing it. So what can we learn from this? The framing effect shows us that our perception of reality is not purely based on the objective facts, but is deeply influenced by how information is framed. Whether it's marketing, politics, health decisions, or even interpersonal relationships, framing plays a powerful role in shaping our perceptions and guiding our behavior. Understanding how framing works can give us greater control over our choices, allowing us to be more mindful of how others present information to us and how we might present it to others. If you're still awake at this point in the video, your curiosity and attention span are truly impressive, and honestly, that's a rare superpower in a world full of distractions. If you found this video eye-opening, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more insightful content, and drop a comment below sharing your thoughts. Have you ever noticed any of these tactics in your life? Let's talk about it. Thanks for watching, and until next time, keep questioning, keep learning, and keep being aware.